Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. This video is made for educational purposes only. This book is about the life of Steve Jobs, a visionary entrepreneur who revolutionized multiple industries through his creativity and relentless pursuit of perfection. It explores his journey from a young boy to a global icon, highlighting his triumphs and failures, and the lessons learned from his unique approach to business and life. The story is filled with inspiration and caution, showing how passion and imagination can shape the world. Steve Jobs called me in 2004 and asked if I'd write his biography. I said no, because I thought he was still in the middle of his career. But he kept asking, and finally his wife, Laureen, told me to do it now. I agreed and started talking to people who knew him. I met his friends, his enemies, his family, and his co-workers. I saw how he was a complicated man, driven, brilliant, and sometimes difficult. I learned how he built Apple from the ground up and how he kept coming back even when things went wrong. I saw how he changed the world with his ideas and how he made people feel both inspired and frustrated. I talked to the people who worked with him, like Bill Campbell and Jony Ive, and heard stories about how he pushed them to be their best. I saw how he cared about design and how he believed that simplicity was the key to success. I also saw how he struggled with his past, especially with his daughter Lisa, and how he tried to make things right. I learned how he was not just a businessman, but an artist, a visionary, and a father. I saw how he was both a hero and a flawed human being. And I realized that his story wasn't just about Apple, but about the power of creativity, the importance of passion, and the cost of perfection. I told the story as honestly as I could, because I believed that Steve Jobs was one of the most important figures of his time, and that his life deserved to be remembered. So, I was working on this book about Steve Jobs. I had been talking to people who knew him, and I had met his friends, his enemies, his family, and his co-workers. I had seen how he was a complicated man, driven, brilliant, and sometimes difficult. I had learned how he built Apple from the ground up and how he kept coming back even when things went wrong. I had seen how he changed the world with his ideas and how he made people feel both inspired and frustrated. I had talked to the people who worked with him, like Bill Campbell and Jony Ive, and heard stories about how he pushed them to be their best. I had seen how he cared about design and how he believed that simplicity was the key to success. I had also seen how he struggled with his past, especially with his daughter Lisa, and how he tried to make things right. I had learned how he was not just a businessman, but an artist, a visionary, and a father. I had seen how he was both a hero and a flawed human being. And I had realized that his story wasn't just about Apple, but about the power of creativity, the importance of passion, and the cost of perfection. I had told the story as honestly as I could, because I believed that Steve Jobs was one of the most important figures of his time, and that his life deserved to be remembered. Arthur Schiebel died in August 1955, and the adoption was finalized. A few months later, Joanne and Abdul Fattah got married in a Catholic church in Green Bay. Abdul Fattah got his PhD in international politics the next year, and they had a daughter named Mona. After their marriage ended in 1962, Joanne lived a life that was full of travel and dreams. Her daughter, Mona Simpson, wrote about it in her book Anywhere But Here. Steve Jobs never knew his biological parents, and it would be 20 years before he met them. He knew from a young age that he was adopted. "My parents were very open with me about that," he said. One day when he was 6 or 7, a girl across the street asked him, "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" That made Steve feel like lightning had struck. He ran into the house and cried. His parents told him they had chosen him, and they made sure he understood that. They told him they had picked him out. That made him feel special, chosen, and abandoned. His friends say that feeling of being abandoned shaped him in big ways. It made him want control over everything he made. It also made him independent. He followed a different path than most people. Later in life, when he was the same age his biological father had been when he left him, Jobs had a child of his own. He eventually took responsibility for her. His ex-wife, Chrisanne Brennan, said that being put up for adoption left him full of broken glass and helped explain some of his behavior. Some people thought his cruelty and harshness came from that past. Jobs denied it, saying that being adopted made him feel special, not abandoned. He believed his parents were his real parents 100%. He never called them adoptive. When talking about his biological parents, he was short and cold. "They were my sperm and egg bank," he said. That was how he saw them. Steve grew up in the Santa Clara Valley, which became known as Silicon Valley because of the chip industry. Don Hoefler, a writer, started calling it that in 1971. Steve loved the area because it had a history of innovation. He was surrounded by smart people who did cool things like make batteries and radar. One of his neighbors, Larry Lang, was a big influence. Larry showed Steve how to build things with simple parts like a microphone, a battery, and a speaker. Steve even told his dad he didn't need an amplifier, which made his dad mad. That moment made Steve realize he was smarter than his parents. It made him feel different, like he didn't quite fit in with his family or the world. His parents, Paul and Clara, tried to help him by giving him better education and letting him do what he loved. They even moved him to a nicer school district so he could stay in a better school. Steve was always curious and didn't like being told what to do. He got into trouble at school, but his parents supported him. He had a teacher, Imogene Hill, who really cared about him and pushed him to learn. She gave him challenges and even a hobby kit to build a camera. Steve started to believe he was special, and that made him feel both proud and alone. He also started to question religion after seeing starving kids in Africa. He stopped going to church and turned to Zen Buddhism instead. He admired the idea of living like Jesus, not just believing in God. His dad worked with lasers, and Steve was fascinated by how precise they had to be. He saw how his dad made things perfectly, even though he didn't get to learn the skills himself. Steve was getting really good at messing with electronics. He started wiring his house with speakers, and since speakers can also pick up sound, he built a secret listening room in his closet. He could hear everything going on in other rooms. One night, he was wearing his headphones and listening to his parents when his dad caught him. The dad was really angry and told Steve to take the whole thing down. Steve was upset, but he didn't back down. He started hanging out with Larry Lang, an engineer who lived nearby. Lang gave Steve a carbon microphone he had been fascinated with and introduced him to Heath kits, those kits you could use to build radios and other electronic stuff. The kits had everything you needed, and the instructions explained how things worked. Steve loved that. He felt like he could build anything if he had the right tools. Lang also got Steve into the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, where students met on Tuesday nights to learn from engineers. Steve got to meet some really cool people and even talked to Bill Hewlett, the CEO. Hewlett gave him parts for a project and even got him a job in the plant. Steve worked on an assembly line, but he loved it. He felt like he was learning something real. He also had a paper route and worked at an electronics store called Haltech. It was like a big junkyard for parts. He learned how to haggle and find deals. He even got his first car with his dad's help. It wasn't the best car, but it was his own. He started smoking pot and experimenting with other drugs. His dad found some in his car and got really mad, but he didn't stop Steve. Steve was getting more into both electronics and literature. He started reading Shakespeare and other big books. He even took an electronics class taught by a teacher named John McCollum, who was full of energy and tricks like firing up a Tesla coil. Steve didn't like authority, and he didn't care much for rules. Woes became a loner as his friends started dating and partying. He didn't like that, and he felt left out. so he started pulling pranks. One time, he built a fake bomb that made a ticking noise and put it in a locker. When the locker opened, it started ticking faster. The principal found it, ran out to the football field with it, and pulled the wires off. Woes couldn't help laughing. He got sent to juvenile detention, where he taught other kids how to shock themselves by wiring fans to bars. He thought shocking people was cool. He even made a game where people got shocked when the ball landed. Woes also got a part-time job at Sylvania, where he worked on a computer for the first time. He taught himself a Fortran and studied computer specs. He wanted to build a simpler computer using fewer parts. He worked in his friend's garage, drinking a lot of soda to save money. He even made a computer that could multiply numbers and show the answer in lights. One day, a friend told him to meet Steve Jobs. They hit it off right away. They shared a love for electronics and music. They both got into Bob Dylan and spent time hunting down Dylan tapes. They even started a club at school for music and pranks. One of their biggest pranks was a giant sign on a balcony that said, "Swab Job," which got Jobs suspended again. One day, Woes read an article about hacking phones with a blue box. He called Steve and they decided to make one. They got parts and built a device that could make free long-distance calls. They tried calling Woes' uncle but got the wrong number. Still, it worked. They even tried calling the Vatican and pretending to be Henry Kissinger. Eventually, they realized they could sell the blue box for money. Steve came up with the idea to make and sell them. They made a small box with parts that cost about $40 and sold it for $150. Steve and Woz had fun making and selling the blue box. They gave themselves silly names. Woz was Berkeley Blue and Steve was O.F. Tobark. They took the device to college dorms and showed people how it worked. They called fancy places like the Ritz in London or a joke service in Australia. They sold almost all of their blue boxes for a lot of money. But things got scary one day at a pizza place. Steve was trying to sell a blue box to some guys when a man pulled out a gun and demanded it. Steve was terrified. He slowly handed over the device, thinking about what to do next. The man even gave Steve a number to call later, but Steve never followed up. The whole experience made Steve and Woz realize they could make things that changed the world. They learned how to work together, and that gave them confidence. Steve later said the blue box was the start of Apple. Steve started getting really picky about what he ate. He read a book called Mucusless Diet Healing System by Arnold Ehret, who was a big deal in the early 1900s. He believed eating only fruits and starchless veggies kept your body healthy and stopped mucus from forming. That meant no bread, no milk, no cereal like Roman meal. Steve even started warning his friends about the dangers of mucus in their bagels. He and his friend Kotke once ate only apples for a whole week. Then Steve tried longer fasts, sometimes up to a week. He said after a week, he felt amazing, like he could walk all the way to San Francisco. He mixed up vegetarianism, Zen, meditation, and even drugs, which was really popular on college campuses back then. Even though he didn't really follow it at Reed, there was still that tech geek part of him that would come back later. One day, Steve wanted to make some cash and decided to sell his IBM typewriter. He walked into a room and found the guy who wanted to buy it was having sex with his girlfriend. Steve started to leave, but the guy asked him to wait. That's when Steve met Robert Friedland, who really impressed him. Friedland had a lot of charisma and was into Eastern spirituality. He had been in trouble with the law for LSD and had been in prison. He later went to Reed and ran for student body president. He had a spiritual name, wore Indian clothes, and was really into being a guru. Steve started to act like Friedland, copying his style and even treating him like a teacher. But eventually, Steve realized Friedland was a con artist. Steve and Friedland would go to the Hare Krishna temple on Sundays, dancing and singing. Friedland had a commune called All One Farm where Steve helped out by pruning apple trees. Steve would eat a lot and then purge, which made his friends worried. He started to feel like Friedland was too much like a cult leader, and he didn't like the way the commune was becoming more like a business. Steve got a job at Atari, which was a big video game company. He worked as a technician for just $5 an hour. His boss, Alcorn, thought Steve was smart and had a lot of energy, even though he was a dropout from Reed College. Steve was assigned to work with a strict engineer named Don Lang. Lang didn't like Steve at all. He said Steve smelled bad and was hard to deal with. Steve thought his vegetarian diet would keep him clean, but it didn't work. Lang wanted to fire him, but Atari's boss, Bushnell, decided to let Steve work the night shift so he could be alone. Steve stayed late, worked hard, and was pretty rude to people when he had to talk. He called them dumb shits, but he still got along with the boss because he was thoughtful and liked to talk about big ideas like free will and destiny. Steve also made friends with Ron Wayne, a guy at Atari who had started a company before. Ron was into starting businesses, and Steve wanted to start one too. They talked about making slot machines, but Ron said it was too risky. Steve was fascinated by Ron's ideas and learned a lot from him. He also had a moment with Ron where he found out Ron was gay. Ron told him it was okay, and Steve respected that. Steve wanted to go to India to find a guru, and his friend Friedland helped him get there. Steve solved some problems in Europe first, then went to India. He got sick from bad food, but he recovered and met a lot of people. He tried to find enlightenment through meditation and simplicity, but it was hard. He stayed in India for 7 months and came back changed. He started to value intuition over logic, and it influenced how he thought about his work later. Steve found a teacher right in his own neighborhood. His name was Shunryu Suzuki, and he ran a Zen center in San Francisco. He came to Los Altos every Wednesday to teach. Jobs started going to his classes and even joined retreats at a monastery near Carmel. He became really serious about meditation, and he met some friends there, like Chrisann Brennan and Elizabeth Holmes. Jobs spent a lot of time with his teacher, Kobun, and they talked about life and spirituality. Kobun was funny and spoke in poetic ways, but Jobs took it very seriously. He even stayed with Kobun's family in the evenings when his teacher's wife was working the night shift. Jobs also tried primal scream therapy, which was a new kind of psychotherapy. He went to a place in Oregon run by a man named Arthur Janoff. Jobs wanted to understand his past, especially about being adopted. He told his friends he was struggling with that. He even talked about his anger over being given up. But he didn't find the answers he was looking for. Still, he felt a little more confident after the therapy. Jobs had a strong personality, and he believed he could make people believe in themselves. He even helped his friend Elizabeth Holmes break free from a cult by driving her to his farm and making her drive a car she didn't know how to use. He showed her that she could do anything if she trusted him. Steve Jobs dreamed of starting his own business. He thought the Bay Area was a special place. Great music came from there, like the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin, and so did important inventions like the integrated circuit. But at first, people in the counterculture didn't like computers. They saw them as tools of control, not freedom. Some even thought they were dangerous, like the government or the military. But by the 1970s, things started changing. People began to see computers as a way to express themselves and be free. A poet named Richard Brautigan wrote a famous poem about it, and Timothy Leary, a famous thinker, said computers were like the new LSD. Steve met a man named Stuart Brand, who helped bring together the counterculture and technology. Brand started a magazine called the Whole Earth Catalog, which encouraged people to use technology to live better lives. Steve liked that idea. He was especially moved by the last issue, which had a quote, "Stay hungry. Stay foolish. Steve and Wozniak started working on a computer together. They called it the Apple I. They wanted to make a personal computer that people could use at home. They had to find cheap parts and write software by hand. Steve helped Wozniak get components and even talked to salespeople to get parts for free. They decided to start their own company. They needed a name. Steve suggested Apple. It sounded fun and friendly. It also made people think about computers in a new way. They picked it. Apple was born. Steve needed someone to help Wozniak leave his job at HP. He found Ron Wayne, an engineer from Atari, who had started a slot machine company before. Wayne knew how to make Wozniak agree that his designs would belong to Apple. They talked for 2 hours, and Wayne convinced Wozniak to give up his rights to the computer parts. Jobs was so grateful that he gave Wayne a 10% share in the company. But Wayne changed his mind later. He didn't want to be personally responsible for Apple's debts, so he left the partnership and took his money. He ended up living a quiet life in Nevada, playing slot machines and getting a small pension. Jobs and Wozniak then made their first computer, the Apple I. They built 50 of them to sell to a store called the Byte Shop. They worked in Jobs' garage, with friends helping. Jobs even got his dad to help set up the space. They had to borrow money and sell parts to get everything done. Finally, they delivered the computers to the store, and the deal was made. So, after the Apple I, Jobs and Wozniak had to face bigger competitors. The IMSA i8080 and the Sol 20 were both better looking and more complete. These machines were made by smart people like Lee Felsenstein and Gordon French, who were part of the Homebrew Computer Club. At the first big computer show in Atlantic City, Jobs and Wozniak brought their Apple I and a new prototype. Felsenstein said the Apple I was thoroughly unimpressive. Wozniak was nervous, hearing people talk about business in ways he didn't understand. He stayed in his hotel room, working on the new machine. Jobs walked around the show, not impressed with what he saw. He realized that personal computers needed to come in a full package, not just parts. That's why he wanted the Apple II to have a nice case and a built-in keyboard. Wozniak worked hard on the Apple II, even testing it on a color TV. He connected it to a projector and saw colors pop on the screen. Only one person saw it, the hotel's technician who said he'd buy it. But making the Apple II needed more money. Jobs tried to sell it to Atari, but the manager didn't like him. He was barefoot and didn't care about proper behavior. Jobs then met Chuck Peddle from Commodore, who liked the Apple II. But when he suggested buying Apple, Wozniak was surprised. Jobs didn't mind. He thought Commodore was sleazy. There was tension between Jobs and Wozniak about who deserved more credit. Wozniak's dad told Jobs he didn't deserve anything. Jobs cried, but he was willing to end the partnership. Wozniak knew they needed each other. Jobs wanted the Apple II to look sleek, like a Cuisinart. He got help from a consultant to make a plastic case. He also made sure the power supply was quiet and efficient, using a smart design from Rod Holt. They needed more money, so Jobs asked Nolan Bushnell, who suggested Don Valentine. Valentine met Jobs and saw he wasn't the typical businessman. He recommended Mike Markkula, who became a big help. Markkula wrote a business plan, imagining Apple becoming a Fortune 500 company. He believed in the future of personal computers. Markkula offered to give Apple $250,000 if he got a third of the company. Jobs, Wozniak, and Markkula met by the pool and agreed. Jobs was excited, but he had to convince Wozniak to leave his job at HP. Wozniak didn't want to give up his secure job, so Markkula gave him a deadline. Wozniak refused, and Jobs got upset. He cried, yelled, and even went to Wozniak's house to beg. His dad finally helped convince Wozniak, and he agreed to join Apple. On January 3, 1977, Apple officially started. It bought out the old partnership between Jobs and Wozniak. Markula became like a father to Jobs. He taught him about marketing and how to focus on what really matters. He wrote a paper about empathy, focus, and how people judge a product by how it looks. Jobs took these ideas to heart and used them for years. Jobs then met Regis McKenna, a top publicist. McKenna was impressed by Jobs' ideas and agreed to help with Apple's image. He redesigned the Apple logo to look simple and modern. Jobs liked it even though it cost more to print. He also made sure the Apple II looked sleek and friendly, unlike other computers. Apple launched the Apple II at a big computer fair in San Francisco. Jobs paid a lot to get a prime spot. The display was fancy, with black velvet and a big logo. People loved the Apple II, and Apple got hundreds of orders. Jobs even played a prank with a fake computer called the Zaltair. As Apple grew, Jobs became more demanding. He yelled at his team and didn't like taking orders. Markula brought in Mike Scott to help manage Jobs. Scott was tough and didn't bend to Jobs' will, which made Jobs very upset. They had fights over things like badge numbers, but eventually they found a way to work together. Jobs and Wozniak had a strong partnership, but their relationship started to change as the company grew. Jobs became more focused on making things perfect, even if it meant spending a lot of time on small details. Mike Scott, who helped manage the company, believed in practical solutions and didn't want to let perfection slow them down. One example was the color of the Apple II case. There were thousands of beige shades to choose from, but Jobs wanted something different. Scott had to stop him from making his own color. Jobs also insisted on white engineering benches instead of the standard gray. These disagreements led to a big argument in front of Markula, who finally sided with Scott. Jobs also wanted to change how Apple treated customers. He pushed for a 1-year warranty, which surprised Scott because the usual was 90 days. Jobs got so upset during their argument that he started crying, and they had to walk around the parking lot to cool down. Scott finally agreed to let Jobs keep the warranty. Wozniak was getting frustrated with Jobs' strict style. He wanted a more relaxed, fun work environment, but Jobs thought Wozniak wasn't serious enough. Despite the tensions, the company was doing well, and Apple was gaining attention. An analyst named Ben Rosen helped spread the word about the Apple II, and a developer created a program called VisiCalc that made computers useful for businesses. This made Apple even more popular. The Apple II became a huge success, selling nearly 6 million units over 16 years. Even though Wozniak is often credited for the design, Jobs was the one who made it into a complete product and built the company around it. Even then, Steve Jobs kept bending the truth. Arthur Rock, one of his early investors, remembered how Jobs once told the board that he wasn't sure if he was the father of his child. He even told a Time reporter that 28% of American men could be the dad. That made Kristen Brennan, the mother, think he was saying she'd slept with a lot of men. She felt he was trying to blame her and avoid responsibility. Later, Jobs said he wished he'd handled it better. He admitted he didn't want to be a father then, but when the test proved the child was his, he agreed to support her and even gave her a home. He tried to do the right thing, but he still had a lot to learn. Jobs started to change in some ways. He stopped using drugs, wasn't so strict about being vegan, and didn't go on Zen retreats as much. He started dressing nicer, buying suits from a fancy store in San Francisco. He also started dating Barbara Jasinski, a woman from his publicist's office. But he still had that wild side. He'd skinny dip with friends, ride a motorcycle with orange tassels, and even dress like Jesus at a company party. His new house had cool gadgets and art, but it was mostly empty because he was too picky to put furniture in it. He wanted to make a big difference with his next computer. He started the Lisa project, but it wasn't going well. He also worked with Bill Atkinson, a programmer who helped make the computer more powerful. Jobs wanted to create something that would change the world, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. After the Xerox PARC visit, Steve Jobs was blown away by what he saw. The graphical interface was like a dream come true. He couldn't wait to bring this idea to Apple. He rushed back to the office, full of energy and ideas. He told his team they had to do it, create a computer that was simple, fast, and easy to use. He even called it the Macintosh, after his daughter. But getting the idea into a real product wasn't easy. Jobs wanted everything perfect, and that made things hard. He pushed his engineers and designers to make the interface feel natural, like using a kitchen appliance. He wanted icons, menus, and a mouse that worked smoothly. He even helped design the mouse, making sure it was simple and affordable. Jobs was so excited about the project that he started managing it himself, even though he wasn't supposed to. He called his engineers at all hours, arguing over details. Some of them didn't like it, but they knew he cared about making something amazing. His passion inspired them, even if it made things tense at times. Meanwhile, Apple was growing fast. It was about to go public, and Steve was the face of the company. He helped pick the banks that would sell the stock. He was confident, even a bit arrogant, but he knew what he was doing. The IPO made him a billionaire overnight, but he still had a lot to learn about leadership and people. Steve Jobs was rich now, but he still lived simply. He didn't need fancy cars or big houses. He bought a nice car but drove it himself. When Markula offered him a Learjet, Jobs said no. He didn't want to be flashy or have a big entourage. He cared more about making great products than about money. He even made a promise to himself that he wouldn't let his wealth change who he was. He stayed in simple houses, didn't need a personal staff, and didn't want to be protected. He was proud of his family, especially his parents, and gave them a lot of stock. They sold some to pay off their mortgage, and it made them happy. Jobs didn't want to live a rich, showy life like some of his coworkers. He preferred to be modest and focused on his work. He was famous now, too. Magazines like Inc. and Time wrote about him, calling him a revolutionary. He looked like a rock star with his beard and style, but he still had that intense, hypnotic stare. He didn't like people who acted like they were saving the world through charity. He gave money quietly, without fanfare, and cared more about making great products than about being seen as a philanthropist. But he was also looking for something new. He wanted to build a computer that was simple, fast, and easy to use. He found Jeff Raskin, who had a dream to make a cheap computer for everyone. Raskin had ideas, but Jobs wanted something even better. He pushed for a more powerful chip and a mouse, even though Raskin didn't like the idea. They argued a lot, but Jobs believed in making something amazing. He took over the project, and the Macintosh was born. Steve Jobs didn't like sharing credit. He wanted to be the one who got the glory, even if others had helped. So when Jeff Raskin, the man who started the Macintosh project, tried to give a talk to the whole company, Jobs canceled it. He didn't tell anyone. But Raskin showed up anyway and found 100 people waiting to hear him. He gave the talk anyway. Raskin was angry and wrote a long, harsh letter to Mike Scott, the president of Apple. He called Jobs a terrible manager and said he didn't trust him. Scott had to deal with Jobs again, and this time, he let Jobs win. Raskin was told to take a break. Jobs said it was like going back to the garage. He got his own team and felt in control. Jobs didn't care about the Apple II anymore. He wanted the Mac to be the future. He pushed people to leave their old projects and join him. He even pulled the plug on Hertzfeld's computer to make him change his mind. Jobs had a way of making people excited about the Mac. He showed them how it would look and work, and they believed him. He called it the reality distortion field. People thought he was crazy, but they followed him anyway. Jobs got rid of Mike Scott and took full control of the Mac team. He made them work fast and hard, even if it didn't make sense. He believed he was special, like Einstein or Gandhi. He didn't follow rules, and he didn't care if others thought he was wrong. Jobs knew he was different. He didn't care about the old Apple II anymore. He wanted the Mac to be the future. He pushed people to leave their old projects and join him. He even pulled the plug on Hertzfeld's computer to make him change his mind. Jobs had a way of making people excited about the Mac. He showed them how it would look and work, and they believed him. He called it the reality distortion field. People thought he was crazy, but they followed him anyway. Jobs got rid of Mike Scott and took full control of the Mac team. He made them work fast and hard, even if it didn't make sense. He believed he was special, like Einstein or Gandhi. He didn't follow rules, and he didn't care if others thought he was wrong. Working with Jobs was hard. He was unpredictable. One day he'd say something was terrible, and the next day he'd say it was amazing. He'd flip between ideas like a light switch. The team learned to deal with this by using something they called a low-pass filter. It helped them smooth out the noise and focus on what really mattered. Jobs wasn't mean on purpose. He was emotionally smart. He knew how to read people and push them. He could make someone feel small, but then lift them up and put them on a pedestal. People who could stand up to him, like Joanna Hoffman, ended up being the best. They worked harder and did better because they wanted to impress him. Even though Jobs was tough, he inspired people to make great things. The Mac team shared his passion for creating something beautiful, not just something profitable. They worked long hours and they loved it. They made t-shirts that said, 90 hours a week and loving it. Jobs wanted Apple's products to look clean and simple. He said they should be bright and honest, not like Sony's dark, heavy designs. He wanted them to feel like modern art. He believed simple designs made things easier to use. But sometimes, simplicity could make things look scary or hard to use. He told designers, we have to make things intuitively obvious. For example, he loved the idea of the desktop metaphor for the Mac. People already knew how to deal with a desk and papers, so they could understand a computer screen like that. Jobs met Maya Lin, a young designer famous for her Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She asked him why computers looked like clunky TVs. Jobs said he wanted them to be thin and flat, but the tech wasn't ready yet. He admired Japanese and European design, especially the work of Dieter Rams and Charles Eames. He wanted Apple to be part of that world. Jobs and his team spent months designing the Mac. He wanted it to look friendly, like a human face. They made it tall and narrow, with a chin-like edge and a forehead that didn't look too big. The design was patented in his name. He also cared a lot about what people saw on the screen. He pushed Bill Atkinson to include rounded corners in graphics, saying they were everywhere. Atkinson finally gave in, and the Mac used rounded corners for years. Jobs also loved fonts. He got Susan Kerr to design them, and they were named after big cities. He was very picky about details, even small things like title bars. He made the team redesign them many times. His attention to design helped make the Mac a success and inspired the future of Apple. Jobs met Bill Mogul, a designer at Frog Design, and their handshake started a big team-up between Apple and the design firm. Frog Design opened in Palo Alto with a big contract from Apple, and from then on, every Apple product said designed in California. Jobs had learned from his dad that even hidden parts of a product should be made with care. He looked at the circuit board inside the Macintosh and said the memory chips looked ugly. An engineer asked why it mattered, and Jobs explained that a great carpenter wouldn't use bad wood even if no one saw it. He wanted everything, even the inside parts, to be beautiful. He also cared a lot about how the Mac looked on the outside. He made the team redo the box design 50 times. He wanted it to look great, even though people would throw it away after opening. Some people thought he was wasting money on the box instead of saving on the chips, but Jobs believed every detail was important. When the design was done, he had the whole team sign their names inside each Mac. He signed last, in lowercase letters, and then celebrated with champagne. He saw his work as art, and he wanted his team to feel proud of what they made. Jobs was named Man of the Year when he was 27, and he really cared about it. He thought it was cool. A reporter named Mike Moritz wrote a bad article about him, and the editors in New York didn't want to put him on the cover. They decided to put a computer sculpture instead. Jobs was really upset. He opened the magazine and saw his name wasn't there. He read the article, and it was so bad he cried. He learned that the media isn't trustworthy and not to get too excited about stuff like that. Apple launched the Lisa in January 1983, a year before the Mac was ready. Jobs paid his bet to Couch. He went to New York to help promote the Lisa, even though he wasn't on the Lisa team. He knew how to do interviews and make them dramatic. He set up a Lisa in his hotel room with flowers and gave interviews to big reporters. But he couldn't help mentioning the Macintosh. The articles said the Mac would be the best computer ever. The Lisa didn't do well and was soon canceled. Jobs realized Apple had to focus on the Mac. The Mac team moved to a new building with cool stuff like a piano and a motorcycle. Jobs hired smart, creative people and tested them with weird questions. He had retreats where he told his team to never compromise and that the journey was the reward. He wanted them to feel like they were part of something special. He even told them customers don't know what they want until you show them. Jobs got really angry when he visited Japan. He didn't act like a respectful guest. He wore jeans and sneakers, which didn't match the fancy suits of the Japanese managers. When they gave him little gifts, he left them behind and didn't give them anything in return. He didn't like the way the engineers bowed and offered their products. He called some of the devices crap and made fun of their work. Some people in Japan were surprised, but others found it funny. The last stop was Sony's factory in Tokyo. Jobs thought it looked messy and not very nice. He didn't like how much work was done by hand. When he got back to the hotel, his boss, Belleville, suggested using Sony's disk drive. Jobs didn't agree and decided to work with another company instead. But later, when he realized Sony's engineers had secretly helped Apple, he was happy. He thanked them and admitted they had done the right thing. Jobs and Scully kept walking through New York, talking about their lives and dreams. Scully shared how he loved drawing in Paris and wished he were an artist. Jobs said he would be a poet if he weren't working with computers. They stopped at a music store where Jobs showed Scully his favorite songs, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Ella Fitzgerald, and some jazz artists. Then they walked back to the San Remo, where Jobs planned to buy a big apartment. The moment happened on a terrace outside the penthouse. Scully was scared of heights and stayed close to the wall. They talked about money. Jobs wanted $1 million in salary, and $1 million for a bonus. He said he'd pay for it if needed. Scully said Jobs was the best person he'd ever met and that Apple needed someone like him. Jobs gave Scully a long, serious look. Scully tried to say they could just be friends, but Jobs challenged him. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world? Scully felt shocked and couldn't say no. They left the apartment and walked back to the hotel. A few weeks later, Scully arrived in California for an Apple meeting. Jobs sat on the floor, playing with his feet. Scully tried to plan how to make Apple's products better, but the meeting turned into chaos. Jobs criticized the Lisa team, and people started arguing. Then an earthquake happened, and everyone ran in different directions. Scully thought of a joke about Apple and the Boy Scouts. At breakfast, Jobs showed Scully his simple, almost bare apartment. He talked about wanting to leave a mark before he died. They became close friends, talking all the time. But Scully started to see that Jobs wasn't like him. Jobs was harsh with people, and Scully tried to help him, but Jobs didn't change. Their friendship began to fall apart. Jobs was at the Grand Hyatt in Manhattan, getting ready for the press preview. A Sunday morning call was set up. The software manager told Jobs calmly about the problem. Hertzfeld and the others listened on the phone, holding their breath. They just needed 2 more weeks. They could send out a demo version of the software first, and then replace it later. Jobs didn't get angry. He said they were really great. He believed they could do it. He told them to finish by the end of the week. Everyone was surprised. They did it. Jobs pushed them to do the impossible again. During the final days, they worked all night. Randy brought chocolate-covered espresso beans to keep them going. When Jobs came in on Monday, he found Hertzfeld asleep on the couch. They talked about a small bug, and Jobs said it wasn't a problem. Hertzfeld went home. The factory started making Macintosh boxes with colorful drawings. Jobs said real artists ship, and they did. Jobs wanted a commercial as revolutionary as the product. He asked for something that would stop people in their tracks. The ad was made by Chiat Day. Lee Clow, the creative director, worked on it. They came up with the idea of why 1984 won't be like 1984. Jobs loved it. They made a sci-fi ad with a rebellious woman fighting against Big Brother. It was like a Blade Runner movie. Jobs wanted to show Apple as a rebel company, like the hackers he used to be part of. The ad was shown during the Super Bowl. Millions watched. It was a huge hit. It became one of the greatest commercials ever. Jobs had a way of making product launches feel like big moments. He used ads, media coverage, and dramatic unveilings to create excitement. Every new product he launched felt like history was being made. The night before the Macintosh launch, everything was going wrong. Jobs was super picky about how the animation looked on the screen and kept changing things. He also didn't like the lights on stage and made Scully move around to give his opinions. Scully didn't know much about lighting, so he gave answers like someone who's not sure. The whole rehearsal went on for 5 hours, and people were really stressed. Scully said Jobs was making everyone crazy, and they didn't think they'd finish in time. The next morning, the big room was full of people. Jobs wore a neat blue blazer, white shirt, and green bow tie. He was really nervous and told Scully it was the most important moment of his life. Scully gave him a hand and said good luck. Jobs started the meeting by reading a poem by Bob Dylan. The audience liked it because it reminded them of his wild side. Then Scully talked about the company's money, but people got bored. Jobs came back and told a story about IBM missing out on a chance to buy Apple in 1958. He built up the Macintosh as the only hope to beat IBM. The crowd got excited and started cheering. The 1984 ad played, and everyone stood up. Jobs showed off the Macintosh, and it talked to the audience with a funny voice. People were stunned by how cool it was. After the big event, Jobs gave each Macintosh team member a personalized computer. It was a long, hard day, but they pulled it off. Jobs was tough to work with, but no one could have made the Macintosh happen without him. After the big Macintosh launch, Jobs and Microsoft started working together. Both teams were excited about making new software for the Mac that could change personal computing. They went to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. Microsoft put a big team on the project, more than Jobs had. Jobs thought the Microsoft programmers didn't have much taste, but they kept improving their work. Eventually, Jobs liked Excel so much that he made a secret deal with Gates. If Microsoft made Excel only for the Mac for 2 years, Jobs would stop working on his own BASIC for the Mac and instead use Microsoft's version. Gates took the deal, which made Apple's team upset. For a while, Jobs and Gates got along better. That summer, they met at a conference in Wisconsin. No one knew Apple was making a new computer with a graphical interface. Jobs and Gates were quiet about it, but they both knew they had something special. Gates started going to Apple's meetings often. He enjoyed watching Jobs work with his team. Jobs was intense, always pushing people and talking about how the Mac would change the world. Sometimes he was confident, and sometimes he was scared. He'd tell Gates everything was fine one day, and the next day he'd worry about whether the Mac would sell. Jobs and Gates had some fights too. Once, Gates told Jobs that only 600 Xerox stars had been sold. The next day, Jobs said 300 had been sold in front of everyone, forgetting what Gates had said. No one dared tell him he was wrong. Another time, Jobs said there would be no manuals for the Mac, which made Gates wonder if he really meant it. They had a lot of ups and downs, but they kept working together. Eventually, Microsoft made Windows, a graphical interface for IBM PCs. Jobs was angry, but Gates stayed calm and showed him the product. Jobs said it was terrible, but Gates laughed and said it was a nice little piece of shit. They walked around Cupertino, and Jobs tried to calm down. Even though Microsoft's Windows wasn't great at first, it got better and became really popular. Jobs never stopped being angry, thinking Gates had no shame. But in the end, Microsoft won the war for operating systems, even though Apple had made the better product. This made Jobs realize that being the best doesn't always mean winning. Steve and John Scully were trying to act like good friends, even though they had some big problems. They had a dinner party to celebrate Scully's first year at Apple. Jobs invited a lot of people, including the board, managers, and even some investors. He acted really happy and made a toast about how great the year had been. He gave Scully a bunch of memorabilia and praised him a lot. Scully said they were the two leaders of Apple, but some people at the table thought Jobs was taking over. Scully tried to be in charge, but Jobs wasn't easy to control. At a meeting, Scully pushed for changes, but Jobs kept fighting back. People wanted Scully to stop Jobs, but he didn't. Jobs also started building a new factory for the Macintosh. He wanted it to look perfect, with bright colors and white walls. He even tried to paint machines blue, but it messed up the equipment. A manager quit because of all the trouble. Jobs hired someone who could stand up to him, but also knew how to please him. The factory ended up looking like a colorful art show, but Jobs was still obsessed with making everything spotless. Jobs got angry when a French president's wife asked about workers' conditions. He insulted her and even got a speeding ticket. In Europe, he acted rude and made demands, even threatening to cut off sales unless people gave him bigger numbers. He had some fights with managers, but he could be charming when he wanted to. The Macintosh was beautiful but slow and had a lot of problems. Sales started to drop, and Jobs made a bad decision by selling fake Macintosh XL computers. He was desperate and unhappy. The new ad for Apple was dark and insulting, and people didn't like it. Jobs and Scully agreed to run the commercial during the Super Bowl, even though most people didn't like it. They went to the game together with Scully's wife, who didn't like Jobs, and Jobs' new girlfriend. The ad came on near the end of the game, but fans didn't react much. People across the country said it insulted Apple's customers. Jobs was uncomfortable with the ad and the situation at Apple. He traveled to New York for press interviews. A manager helped him with his hotel room, but he kept changing his mind about everything: flowers, food, even the piano. He got angry at the manager for not knowing what a calla lily was. She finally found them, but then he started complaining about what she was wearing. Jobs turned 30 and threw a big, fancy but fun party. He invited people like Bill Gates and Wozniak. The party had music, food, and even Ella Fitzgerald. People gave him gifts, but he left them all in a hotel room. He talked about growing old and creativity, saying artists need to keep changing and not look back too much. He seemed to know his life was about to change. Soon, some of the Mac team left Apple. They were frustrated with Jobs' management and the problems with the Macintosh. Jobs tried to stop them, but they went anyway. Wozniak, Apple's co-founder, also left to start a new company. Jobs got angry when he found out about Wozniak's new product, and even stopped a design firm from working with him. He didn't want Wozniak's product to look like Apple's. Jobs got angry when he found out Wozniak was making a new product. He didn't want it to look like Apple's stuff. He even tried to stop a design firm from working with Wozniak. The firm said no. Jobs sent them a letter to force them to give him the designs or destroy them. One of the designers, Herbert Pfeiffer, talked about the fight in the newspaper. He said it was a power play between Jobs and Wozniak. Jobs got even more upset. He didn't talk to some people for a while. He even refused to let a friend into his house. Wozniak stayed at Apple as a spokesman, but started working with another design firm. Soon, Jobs and Scully had a big fight. They didn't agree on how to run Apple. Scully wanted to make more money by keeping the Macintosh price high. Jobs wanted it to be cheaper. They also had personal issues. Scully wanted Jobs to be his mentor. Jobs wanted Scully to be like a father figure. But when they stopped liking each other, it got worse. Scully thought Jobs was too obsessed with details. Jobs thought Scully didn't care about products. They fought in meetings and even insulted each other in front of other people. The board got worried and told Scully to take charge. They told Jobs to fix the Macintosh problems. Jobs got more and more angry. He started yelling at people and making everyone feel scared. Some managers tried to get rid of him. Jobs kept changing his mind. Sometimes he wanted to run a new lab, other times he wanted to fire Scully. Finally, Scully told Jobs he had to step down from leading the Macintosh team. Jobs was upset and cried. He didn't want to leave, but he had to. He agreed to slowly move to a new role. Jobs was angry and hurt, but he didn't give up. That night, he took his Macintosh team to dinner at Nina's Cafe in Woodside. Jean-Louis Gasset was there too, because Scully wanted him to take over the Macintosh division. Jobs invited him to join them. Belleville made a toast to those of us who really understand what the world according to Steve Jobs is all about. That phrase had been used before by people at Apple who didn't like how Jobs saw the world. After the others left, Belleville sat with Jobs in his Mercedes and told him to plan a fight with Scully. Jobs had been invited to sign a deal in China during the 1985 Memorial Day weekend. He had told Scully he wanted to go, and Scully had agreed. Jobs decided to use Scully's absence to try to take over. For days, he talked to people about his plan. He told Mike Murray, "I'm going to launch a coup while John is in China." On Friday, May 24th, Jobs told his top team about his plan to get rid of Scully. He also told Jay Elliott, the human resources director, who told him the plan wouldn't work. Elliott had talked to some board members, but most were with Scully. Jobs still went ahead. He even told Gasset about it, even though Gasset was coming to take his job. That evening, Gasset told Al Eisenstadt, Apple's general counsel, what Jobs was planning. Gasset told Eisenstadt to warn Scully. "Steve's plotting to get rid of you," Gasset said. On Friday morning, Scully came back early and confronted Jobs. He asked if Jobs wanted to throw him out of the company. Jobs said he thought Scully was bad for Apple. Scully lost his temper. He stammered and said he didn't trust Jobs. Jobs tried to get the board to support him, but most were with Scully. At the end of the meeting, Jobs left in tears. He went back to his office and cried with his loyalists. Scully was sad too. He almost resigned but decided to stay. He agreed to meet Jobs the next day. Jobs tried to talk to Scully, but Scully wouldn't let him run the company. Jobs was left with no choice. He called his friends and told them it was over. He was broken. Jobs slipped into the back of the auditorium, listening as Scully talked to the team about the new plans. He didn't say much, but he watched Scully closely. Scully didn't look at him, but he remembered that look, Steve's cold, unblinking stare. It stayed with him for years. Scully thought back to when they were friends, visiting Edwin Land in Cambridge. Land had lost his company, and Jobs had been angry. Now Scully was doing the same to Jobs. He introduced Gassé as the new leader of the Macintosh and Apple II teams. Jobs's title was chairman, but it didn't mean much. Scully didn't mention him. There was some awkward applause, but not much else. Jobs stayed home for days, listening to Dylan, especially the times they are a Changin. He felt like a loser, like he'd been punched in the gut. His friends came to visit, and they talked about the past. Dylan's new album was playing, but Jobs didn't like it. He wanted to hear something simpler, something like the old songs he loved. But even that didn't cheer him up. He felt betrayed, like the people who had once supported him, Rock, Markula, Scully, had all left him. He went to Europe, to Paris and Moscow, trying to find peace. He met with officials, talked about technology, and even mentioned Trotsky. He was angry, but he was also trying to move on. Jobs had left Apple, but he wasn't done fighting. He had started a new company, and he was taking some top Apple people with him. That made his old friends and bosses mad. Campbell, who had been one of Jobs's biggest supporters, was especially angry. He called Daniel Lewin, the guy who had helped build Apple's university relationships, and found out Jobs had taken him. Campbell was so upset he almost walked out of the meeting. He kept waiting for Lewin to call back, even when his wife said he was in the shower. When he finally got through, Lewin confirmed it. Campbell hung up and didn't say a word. Scully and the board were furious too. Rock, who had been helping Jobs before, felt betrayed. He had even invited Jobs to meet his wife and girlfriend. Jobs had never mentioned his new company, and Rock was angry he had lied. Markula, who had always been quiet, also said Jobs had acted ungentlemanly by secretly taking Apple's top people. Jobs tried to respond by writing a resignation letter and giving it to Markula. He wanted to leave things on a good note, but he was still angry. He had thrown a picture of him and Scully out of his office, breaking it in half. From that day on, he never spoke to Scully again. Apple's stock went up after the news, but some people missed Jobs. He was sued for breaking his promises to Apple, and he sold all his shares. He started his new company, Next, and hired a top designer, Paul Rand, to create a logo. Jobs paid a lot for one design, but he believed it was worth it. He had a big argument with Rand about the color of the E in the logo, but in the end, Jobs won. Steve Jobs needed a designer for Next who could make the products look amazing. He thought of Hartmut Esslinger, a wild Bavarian designer he had brought to Apple earlier. Esslinger had helped make Apple's products look great, so Jobs wanted him for Next too. But Esslinger was still working for Apple, and Jobs had to convince Apple to let him work for Next. He wrote a letter explaining that Esslinger knew Apple's designs better than anyone else, and that it was in both Apple's and Next's best interest to use him. Apple wasn't happy with the request, especially since Jobs had once made Esslinger stop working on a project for Apple. Jobs realized he had to settle the lawsuit with Apple first. He and Scully agreed to a deal with no money exchanged. Apple let Next work with Esslinger, but with some rules. Next had to market its machines as high-end, sell only to schools, and not ship until March 1987. Jobs was happy to work with Esslinger, who wanted full control over the design. Jobs pushed for a perfect cube shape, even though it made manufacturing harder. He insisted on spending a lot of money to make the cube look flawless. He also made sure the inside of the machine was as beautiful as the outside, something he had learned from his father. Jobs was intense, always moving, always talking, and never shy about telling people they were wrong. He treated employees with charm or harshness, depending on the situation. He still had his charisma and his wild ideas, just like he had at Apple. Even though Next was struggling financially, Jobs kept pushing for his vision. He believed in his reality distortion field, even when others didn't. Jobs needed money badly, but he didn't want to show it. He waited a week before calling back. Perot sent analysts to check out Next, but Jobs made sure to talk directly with Perot. Perot had once missed the chance to buy Microsoft when Bill Gates was young, and now he didn't want to make that mistake again. Jobs offered Perot a deal that was 3 times more expensive than what venture capitalists had offered. For $20 million, Perot would get 16% of Next after Jobs added another $5 million. That made the company worth about $126 million. But money wasn't what mattered most to Perot. He believed in Next and wanted to help it succeed. He brought a lot of credibility to the company and introduced Jobs to important people, like King Juan Carlos of Spain. Perot even told stories about Jobs' early life, making him seem like a legend. He saw himself in Jobs, saying they were like soulmates. But Gates wasn't a soulmate. Gates was resistant to Jobs' ideas and refused to make software for Next. He criticized the machine, calling it crap. Their rivalry was strong, and they didn't respect each other. Gates said he wouldn't develop for Next, and he made it public, which hurt the company. Jobs got angry and called Gates out in front of others. They had a big fight, but there was a little respect too. Jobs also tried to work with IBM. He had to agree to license his software and partner with IBM, which wasn't easy for him. The deal almost worked, but it eventually fell apart. Finally, Jobs launched the Next computer in October 1988. He made it a big event with a black cube, simple stage, and lots of drama. He talked about how this machine would change computing. He showed how it could play speeches and send emails. He even recorded a message and asked the crowd to add their applause. So, the Next computer was launched with a lot of fanfare. Jobs took the stage, and he talked about how this machine would change the world. He boasted about new ideas, like a big optical disc that was slow and no floppy disk as a backup. He said they had made the first real digital books, showing off Shakespeare and other books. He even joked about being mercurial, which means he changes his mind a lot. He made the audience laugh by looking up the word in the dictionary and reading the definitions. He even made fun of himself by comparing his mood to the planet Mercury. Then he tried to sell the machine by making it sound like it was worth thousands of dollars. But when he announced the price, it was way higher than people expected. Some of the people who helped him with the project were upset because they thought he had promised a lower price. He also said the software wouldn't be ready for a while, which made people nervous. But he tried to keep the mood upbeat by having a violinist play a duet with the computer. People loved that and forgot about the bad news. Jobs also started giving exclusive interviews to magazines, but he went too far by agreeing to multiple exclusives. It backfired a little when one magazine found out another had also gotten an exclusive. Still, the hype kept people interested. In the end, the Next computer didn't sell very well. It was too expensive, and not many people knew how to use it. Sales were way below expectations, and the company kept losing money. Steve wanted to make software that regular people could use, not just experts. He imagined how everyday folks could make amazing 3D images and realistic pictures with it. Pam Kerwin, who worked at Pixar, remembered how Steve would come up with wild ideas about how people could use RenderMan, the software they made. He'd go to a whiteboard and show how to make it simple and fun. The team would get excited, but then wonder what he was thinking. Steve had a way of making people feel inspired, even if they didn't always understand him. RenderMan didn't sell well because people didn't want expensive software for making realistic images. But one company, Disney, loved it. When Roy Disney took over Disney's board, he asked Steve to help bring animation into the future. Steve and his team made a system called CAPS that helped turn drawings into colorful movies. It was used in The Little Mermaid and helped Disney's animation department come back to life. Steve also helped start Pixar's animation team. John Lasseter, who loved making animated stories, joined them. Steve and John shared a passion for design and art. They made a short film called Luxo Jr., which told a simple story about two lamps playing with a ball. It won big at a conference and made Steve proud. He believed in art and technology together, just like the Macintosh did. But Steve had his share of conflicts. He didn't get along with Alvy Ray Smith, another key person at Pixar. They argued a lot, especially when Steve tried to control things. Alvy left Pixar to start his own company, which Microsoft later bought. Steve also had to cut costs at Pixar because things weren't going well, but he kept supporting the animation team because it made him happy. In the end, Steve helped fund a new short called Tin Toy, which won an Oscar. He believed in John Lasseter's talent and wanted to see great art. When the movie won, he celebrated with Lasseter and the team, proud of what they had created. Disney's new leaders, Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, wanted Lasseter back. They loved Tin Toy and saw big potential in animated stories about toys coming to life. But Lasseter stayed loyal to Steve and Pixar. He told Ed Catmull, "I can be a director at Disney, or I can stay here and make history." Disney decided to team up with Pixar instead. They planned to make a toy movie together. Steve had invested almost $50 million of his own money into Pixar. He was losing money at Next, but he kept pushing. He made Pixar employees give up their stock options to get more funding. Even though he was tough about money, he still believed in the power of art and technology together. He thought that combining great stories with digital tools would change animation forever, like how Walt Disney changed it in 1937 with Snow White. Steve realized later that he should have focused more on animation earlier. But he also knew that without his work on hardware and software, Pixar wouldn't have made it. "Life kind of snookered me into doing that," he said. "And maybe it was for the better." Steve had a lot of strong opinions, and one of them was about what his girlfriend should wear. He thought she should look fetching enough, which meant she should dress nicely and stand out. But she wasn't into being a model, and she got really annoyed with his comments. One day, she wrote him a letter saying she wasn't trying to be a model and that he was being too picky. He didn't reply, but a few days later, a box showed up with some fancy clothes from a Japanese designer named Issey Miyake. He loved that designer's style, and he picked out some clothes that fit her perfectly. He even sent her 3 identical pantsuits. She later said those were the first real clothes she ever got from him, and they looked great with her hair. Meanwhile, Mona Simpson was trying to find their father, who had left when she was a kid. She found a retired cop in New York and a detective in California who helped track him down. She met the man in Sacramento, and he was working in a small restaurant. He seemed happy to see her, but he didn't seem to care much about the whole situation. He told her he had another son, a boy named Steve, who had been lost. Mona didn't say anything, but she was shocked. Later, she met with Steve and told him about the restaurant near San Jose, where he used to go. He was surprised and said he remembered meeting the owner, who was Syrian. But he still didn't want to meet his father. He didn't trust him and didn't want to be involved. Lisa, his daughter, had a complicated relationship with him. He wasn't there much, but when he was sweet. He took her places, played with her, and even went rollerblading. But he was also unpredictable, sometimes cold, sometimes warm. Their relationship was like a roller coaster, and neither of them knew how to handle the ups and downs. Steve was still thinking a lot about his past and what he wanted for the future. He talked a lot with Egan, his girlfriend, about things like Buddhism and not getting too attached to things. He believed that wanting too much stuff was bad for your mind, and he even sent her a tape from his Zen teacher. But Egan asked him, "Aren't you going against that by making all these cool products people want?" Steve got upset, and they had big arguments about it. In the end, he still loved making things and being famous. When the Macintosh came out in 1984, Steve was already famous. He showed up at Egan's house with a new Mac in hand and set it up in her room. He told her he didn't think he'd live long, which made him push himself harder. Their relationship started to fade as Egan said she was too young to get married. Soon after, Steve met Tina Redsey, a pretty woman who lived in a hippie kind of way. He was really into her and they had a deep connection. They fought a lot, but they also loved each other. They talked about moving to France and starting a new life, but Steve didn't want to give up his ambitions. Their relationship was full of ups and downs, and Tina felt hurt by how self-centered he was. Eventually, Steve asked her to marry him, but she couldn't. She said it would be too hard for her, and she didn't want to be in a relationship that felt like her own family's. After they broke up, Tina helped start a mental health group and realized Steve might have a condition called narcissistic personality disorder. Even after they were apart, they stayed close. Steve would think about her a lot, and she would visit him when he was sick. They both felt sad they couldn't be together, but they still cared deeply for each other. Laureen Powell was born in New Jersey in 1963. She grew up in a tough home because her father, a Marine pilot, died in a crash. Her mom married again, but it didn't work out. Laureen and her brothers had to deal with a lot of stress for 10 years. She learned to be strong and take care of herself. She went to college, worked at Goldman Sachs, but left because she didn't like the job. She traveled to Italy, then went to Stanford Business School. After a dinner with Steve, she invited him to her apartment. Kat Smith, her friend, came along to pretend to be her roommate. Steve and Laureen got very close. They kissed, hugged, and were very in love. But their relationship had ups and downs. Steve would be very focused on her one moment, then ignore her the next. One night, after a dinner with friends, they had a fight. Laureen stayed at Kat's place. The next morning, Steve showed up with flowers and asked Kat if he could see Laureen. He waited until she was ready and then asked her to marry him. Laureen said yes, but it wasn't a final decision. Steve kept changing his mind, even after she got pregnant. Eventually, he decided to marry her, and they got married in Yosemite in 1991. Their wedding was simple, and they moved into a cozy house in Palo Alto. Laureen started her own business, and they built a happy, normal life together. Jobs loved the way Carl Jones built houses. He used old materials like bricks and wood from telephone poles to make strong, simple homes. Jobs admired how careful and inventive Carl was. He never made a lot of money and stayed in California his whole life. He got ideas from books and magazines. Jobs didn't like buying furniture just because he wanted it. He wanted things he could admire. He only bought a few basics for his house, like a chest of drawers and a mattress. But when he married Laureen and had a child, he had to buy more things. He and his friend Powell spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of furniture they wanted. They even talked about washing machines for weeks. They ended up getting a German washer and dryer that lasted longer and used less water. Jobs also bought a painting by Ansel Adams for his living room. One time, His housekeeper accidentally ruined it, and he had to get someone to fix it. Jobs lived in a modest house in Woodside. Even when he was rich, he didn't have guards or servants. One day, a man named Burrell Smith, who had worked with him, started acting crazy. He would throw rocks at Jobs's house and leave strange letters. Jobs helped get him out of jail but asked Hertzfeld if he'd take care of him if something like that happened to him. Jobs wanted to tear down his old house and build a new one, but he had to fight people who wanted to save it. He finally got permission to tear it down in 2011, but he didn't build a new house. Sometimes he used the old house for parties. Once, Bill Clinton and his wife stayed there when they visited their daughter at Stanford. Lisa moved in with Jobs when she was 14 because she had problems at school. She stayed with them for 4 years. Their relationship was hard, and Lisa sometimes had to borrow money from friends. Jobs didn't go to her Harvard graduation, and they had a lot of fights. Lisa was upset when Simpson sent her the manuscript for the book before it was published. At first, she only read the beginning, and she was shocked to see herself in the story. She felt like the book was full of truths, but also had lies that were close to the truth, which made them hurt even more. Lisa wrote a piece for the Harvard Advocate explaining how she felt. Her first draft was very angry, but she softened it before publishing. She felt like Simpson had betrayed her friendship. She didn't know for 6 years that Mona was collecting stories about her. Lisa and Simpson eventually talked, and they met at a coffee shop. Lisa told Simpson she couldn't finish the book, and Simpson said she would like the ending. Lisa and Simpson had an on-and-off relationship over the years, but it was closer than her relationship with her father. Jobs had a child named Reed, born in 1991. Reed was smart and creative, and he had a lot of his father's charm. He also had sweet manners, which was different from his dad. Reed was a great student and interested in science. He even liked to dress up in costumes as a kid. Lisa had another child, Aaron, who was quieter and sometimes felt left out. She picked up her father's interest in design and architecture. Their youngest child, Eve, was funny and strong-willed. She was good at handling her dad and even made fun of him. She joked that she might run Apple someday if she didn't become president. Jobs had a close relationship with Reed, but was more distant with his daughters. He would sometimes ignore them when he was busy. His wife, Powell, was a bit annoyed because she gave up her career to take care of the kids. Jobs and Powell had a good relationship, but they sometimes had disagreements. Jobs had a strong friendship with Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle. They went on yachts together, and Ellison called Jobs our rich friend. Jobs believed that money didn't make life better and didn't want his kids to have bodyguards like other CEOs. Eventually, Jobs and Pixar made a deal with Disney to make the movie Toy Story. The idea came from John Lasseter, and Jobs helped make sure the movie stayed true to its original vision. Jobs and Jeffrey Katzenberg had a tough negotiation, but Jobs won the fight for creative control. The movie was a big hit and helped Pixar become successful. After Toy Story became a huge success, Steve Jobs got even more excited about Pixar. He wanted to make sure Pixar was seen as its own big company, not just a part of Disney. He started talking to other companies about selling Pixar, but watching the movie helped him realize he was on the edge of changing the movie world forever. He even had friends come to his house to see the film over and over again. Jobs was really picky, wanting every detail perfect. He even made sure the movie was shown in 2 different premieres, one at Disney's and one at his own. This showed how much he wanted control and how much he wanted to be seen as the real creator. When Toy Story finally came out, it made a ton of money and got great reviews. People called it a masterpiece. But Jobs was still upset that reviewers kept saying it was a Disney movie, not a Pixar one. He pushed back, making sure the world knew it was Pixar's work. After the movie's success, Jobs decided to take Pixar public. Even though the bankers were skeptical, he believed in the idea. The IPO was a huge hit, making Pixar worth billions. Jobs didn't care about the money, saying he didn't want a yacht. He just wanted to build a real company with its own brand. With the money, Pixar could now fund its own movies and work with Disney on equal terms. Eventually, Jobs and Disney made a new deal. Pixar would put up half the money for movies and get half the profits. They also agreed on co-branding. Even though there were tough talks, they ended up being friends for a while. Jobs believed in building strong brands, and with Apple and Pixar, he created two of the best in the world. Jobs was angry and frustrated because Apple was losing ground to Microsoft. He blamed John Sculley for bringing in people who only cared about money, not making great products. Jobs said that because Sculley focused too much on profits, Apple's Macintosh computers lost to Microsoft's Windows. Microsoft copied Apple's ideas and became very successful. By 1995, Windows 95 was the biggest operating system ever, and Apple's sales were falling fast. Jobs was bitter, saying that after he left, Apple didn't invent anything new. He even took apart a Mac keyboard to remove the keys he didn't like, then signed it. He said he was changing the world one keyboard at a time. Jobs talked to Larry Ellison about buying Apple, but he didn't want to take it over by force. He hoped Apple would ask him back. But Apple was in trouble. Its market share dropped to just 4%, and the company was losing billions. They needed help, but no one had a good plan. Finally, Jobs reached out to Apple's CEO, Gil Amelio, and proposed that Apple buy his company, Next. He was confident that Next software could save Apple. The deal went through, and Jobs got a big cash payout and some stock. He was finally back in the game, ready to fight again. Jobs wanted to talk to Amelio, so they went for a walk in Palo Alto. During the walk, Jobs asked to be put on Apple's board. Amelio tried to say no, but Jobs made him feel bad because he used to run the company. Amelio said he didn't know what the board would want. But Jobs' energy and enthusiasm made Amelio change his mind. They walked around for a while, and then went back to the house where Lorene and the kids were waiting. They all celebrated the easy deal. Amelio even said Jobs made him feel like a lifelong friend. Later, Amelio had to tell Bill Gates that Apple was buying Next. Gates was upset and called Jobs a super salesman who didn't know much about technology. But Gates also knew the deal would bring Jobs back to power. Jobs, though, wasn't sure if he wanted to return to Apple full-time. Amelio asked him to make a decision, and Jobs finally said he would be an advisor. That's what Amelio announced at Apple's headquarters. Jobs walked in, got a big applause, and said he wasn't going to take over the company. He had other things in life, like Pixar and his family. Jobs went to Pixar to tell Lasseter he was coming back part-time. Lasseter said he had his blessing. Jobs wanted to help Apple again, but he was also careful about how much time he gave to the company. He wanted to leave a legacy, not just for Apple but for the world. He knew he had to be smart and focused if he was going to make a difference again. Amelio pushed back when Jobs suggested killing the Newton project. He said it would cost too much and that it could be a moneymaker. But Jobs wasn't swayed. He wanted to get rid of it, no matter the cost. By May, Amelio announced the Newton division would be spun off, starting its slow decline. Jobs started taking control behind the scenes, telling people he wanted to run Apple again. He wasn't being Machiavellian, just being himself, always wanting to be in charge. Amelio had a tough time at the stockholders' meeting. Shareholders were angry, and he didn't handle it well. Ed Woolard, a board member, was upset and called Jobs. Jobs told him Amelio was the worst CEO he'd ever seen. It was a bold move, but Jobs believed in being honest. Soon, the press started criticizing Amelio, calling him a buffoon. Larry Ellison even joked about taking over Apple and putting Jobs in charge. Jobs stayed quiet about Ellison's plans, which annoyed Emilio. Jobs didn't want to make a big deal about it. He was still torn about coming back to Apple. He had a good life at Pixar and didn't want to give it up. But when he talked to Andy Grove, he realized how much he still cared about Apple. That's when he decided to help Apple again, even if only temporarily. Emilio was still trying to get his life back on track when Jobs pushed him out. Jobs wasn't being mean. He just didn't think Emilio was the right leader for Apple. He told Emilio to take a break and even offered to help him think things through. But Emilio didn't believe Jobs, even though he respected him. He was angry because he felt Jobs had no right to be involved in the decision. Jobs, though, had a way of getting what he wanted. He didn't just talk about taking control, he acted like he was already in charge. When the board finally decided to fire Emilio, Jobs was ready. He came back to Apple with a plan and a fire in his belly. He didn't hide his anger about the company's products, and he made it clear that he wanted to run things. He pushed for big changes, like giving employees better stock options, and he wasn't afraid to argue with the board if they didn't agree. He even threatened to quit if they didn't support him. It worked. The board gave in, and Jobs got the power he wanted. He started bringing in new people to the board, people he trusted and who would follow him. He didn't care about their fame, only their loyalty. He wanted Apple to be great again, and he was ready to do whatever it took. Even though he was still a bit of a hard man to get along with, he had finally found his way back to the company he loved. Steve Jobs had just taken full control of Apple, and he wasn't just running the company, he was trying to make it feel like something special again. He knew the world had forgotten Apple, and he wanted to remind people why it mattered. So he called Lee Clow, a top ad man who had once helped launch the Macintosh with the famous 1984 ad. Clow hadn't worked with Apple in years, but he loved the company like family. Jobs asked him to come up and pitch for the business. Clow didn't want to, but he couldn't say no. He and his team came up with an idea that would change everything. It was called Think Different. It wasn't just an ad. It was a celebration of the people who had changed the world, like Einstein, Picasso, and Martin Luther King. It was a message that Apple wasn't just selling computers, it was inspiring creativity. When Clow showed Jobs the idea, he was moved to tears. He knew this was the kind of work Apple was meant to do. And so, with a new ad campaign and a new sense of purpose, Apple began to shine again. Steve Jobs and Lee Clow knew Apple had to be more than just a computer company. They wanted to show people what made Apple special, not the gadgets, but the ideas and people who used them. They started a big brand campaign called Think Different. It wasn't just ads. It was about celebrating the crazy, creative people who changed the world. Jobs said it wasn't about speed or memory. It was about creativity. He wanted Apple to remind everyone that it was a place for rebels and visionaries. Clow and his team tried different ways to tell that story. They used songs and speeches from famous people like Robin Williams and Robert Frost, but none felt right. Finally, they wrote their own text, starting with "Here's to the crazy ones." Jobs was tough on the writers, yelling at them for not getting it right. But Clow, Ken Segal, and Craig Tanimoto stuck with him. They worked hard to make the message feel real and powerful. Jobs wanted the words to be simple and strong. He even wrote some of the lines himself. They ended up using a voiceover by Richard Dreyfuss, but Jobs almost did it himself. He didn't want people to think it was about him, but about Apple. The ads had black and white pictures of famous people like Einstein and Gandhi, without names. Jobs even called editors and friends to get the right photos. He was passionate about making the campaign feel right. The Think Different campaign became one of Apple's most famous ads. It helped people see Apple as a brand for creative, rebellious thinkers. Jobs was excited about it, and it helped him feel more connected to the company he loved. So, the story continues. After the Think Different campaign became a huge success, Apple started to face some big challenges. Jobs wanted to make sure the Macintosh operating system was kept under Apple's control. He didn't want other companies to make copies of the Mac, because he believed that hardware and software should work together perfectly. But other people at Apple, like Bill Gates, wanted to let other companies use the Mac OS. Jobs resisted, even after he came back to Apple. When Jobs returned, he started to clean up Apple's product line. He realized the company had too many products, and most of them were not good. He made tough decisions, cutting 70% of the products. He even fired a lot of people, but he believed it was necessary to save Apple. He focused on making just 4 great products, one for each group of users: professionals and consumers, desktops and laptops. This helped Apple become more focused and successful again. Jobs also made big changes in design. He brought in Jony Ive, a talented designer, and they worked together to create some of the most iconic products Apple has ever made. Their collaboration led to beautiful, simple designs that people loved. So, Steve Jobs and Jony Ive started working together really closely. They had a special kind of teamwork that made Apple's products look and feel amazing. Jobs believed in simplicity, not just in how things looked, but in how they worked. He wanted everything to be clean, easy to use, and made with care. Jony understood that too. He loved the idea of making products that felt pure and seamless, like the way a knife should feel in your hand. They both cared about making things that felt right in your hands, not just in your eyes. Jobs and Jony would walk around the design studio, looking at models and feeling them. Jobs didn't like reading complex blueprints. He wanted to see and touch things. He'd grab a model, turn it over, and say what he liked or didn't. Jony would take that feedback and make changes. They worked on everything from the shape of the iPhone to the way the packaging opened. Even the little details, like the click of a connector or the way a box felt in your hands, mattered to them. Jobs also cared a lot about the patents and the ideas that made Apple's products unique. He took credit for a lot of things, which sometimes made Jony upset. But Jony knew that without Jobs, many of their ideas wouldn't have made it to the world. They were a team, and together they made Apple's products stand out. Steve Jobs and Jony Ive were working on a new computer for Apple. They wanted something completely different from the old beige boxes. Jobs didn't like the first models they made, but Jony knew how to calm him down. He picked one model that looked playful and not like a boring block. It had a smooth, curved shape and a sea green color, later called Bondi Blue. Jobs loved it and started showing it around the office. He even took it with him everywhere. The design had a special look. The plastic was translucent, so you could see the inside of the computer. Jony said it made the computer feel like it could change and fit your needs. Jobs liked that idea, even though it cost a lot to make. He didn't care about the money, just the look and feel of the product. They had a handle on the iMac, not for carrying but to make it look friendly and approachable. Jobs fought hard to keep the handle, even when the engineers said it was too expensive. He believed it made the computer feel like a friend, not a machine. There were a lot of problems before the big launch. Jobs got angry when he saw a CD tray instead of a clean slot. He also fought over the color of the ad. He wanted the blue to match the iMac exactly. Finally, they got everything right. On the day of the launch, Jobs did a dramatic show, like he did with the first Macintosh. He pulled back a cloth and revealed the iMac. The room was full of applause. He said it looked like it was from another planet, and people loved it. So, the iMac was a big hit. People loved its colorful, curved look and the way it felt friendly. But not everyone was happy. Bill Gates, the boss of Microsoft, said the iMac was just a passing trend. He joked that Apple was only good at colors and that Microsoft would catch up soon. Steve Jobs was furious. He called Gates clueless and said that Apple wasn't just about looks, it was about making computers that felt right and made people happy. The iMac sold a lot. In just a few weeks, it sold over 278,000 units. That was a record for Apple. And even more surprising, a big part of those buyers were people who had never owned a computer before. Jobs loved that. He wanted the iMac to feel like a friend, not just a machine. Then there was the color thing. Jony Ive came up with 4 new colors for the iMac, adding to the original Bondi blue. Jobs was excited and wanted to do it fast. He didn't care about the extra costs or the problems it would cause. He trusted Jony and believed in the design. But there was one more change Jobs wanted: getting rid of the CD tray. He didn't like it, and he didn't care if others said it was a bad idea. He wanted a slot-load drive, even if it meant being behind on technology. It turned out to be a smart move because soon, other companies started making CD drives that could burn music. Apple was slow at first, but it pushed them to be creative again when they finally entered the music market. The iMac was a hit. It sold over 278,000 units in just a few weeks, which was a big deal for Apple. Even more surprising was that a lot of those buyers had never owned a computer before. Steve Jobs loved that. He wanted the iMac to feel like a friend, not just a machine. Then there was the color thing. Jony Ive came up with 4 new colors for the iMac, adding to the original Bondi blue. Jobs was excited and wanted to do it fast. He didn't care about the extra costs or the problems it would cause. He trusted Jony and believed in the design. But there was one more change Jobs wanted: getting rid of the CD tray. He didn't like it, and he didn't care if others said it was a bad idea. He wanted a slot-load drive, even if it meant being behind on technology. It turned out to be a smart move because soon, other companies started making CD drives that could burn music. Apple was slow at first, but it pushed them to be creative again when they finally entered the music market. Jobs had a way of finding talent. Once, he got an email from a young man and invited him in. The meeting didn't go well. Later, Jobs bumped into the guy in the lobby, and the guy asked to show him one of his ideas. Jobs saw a little demo using Adobe Director of a way to fit more icons in the dock. When the cursor moved over the icons, it mimicked a magnifying glass and made each icon balloon bigger. "My God," Jobs said, and hired him on the spot. That feature became a big part of Mac OS X. Jobs was tough, but he had a good eye for talent. People had to be ready for him to attack their ideas, even bite their heads off. But sometimes he'd respect them. He also had a habit of making up scientific facts. Jony Ive said it was weirdly endearing, but when he was right, he was right. Once, Lee Clow showed him a commercial and made some small changes. Jobs was furious, but he was right. There were 2 extra frames that had to be cut. Jobs was still an interim CEO, even though Apple was doing well. He refused to take a big stock grant, saying he didn't want to get rich. He wanted a plane instead. His mentor, Ed Woolard, gave him a Gulfstream V, but Jobs wanted more. He asked for 20 million stock options, which the board wouldn't give. They settled on 10 million, but the stock later dropped. Jobs never used the options, but he got the plane he wanted. He even redesigned the interior. He loved it. At the 20,000 Macworld event, Jobs introduced the new Mac OS X. It used software from Next, which he had bought years earlier. He was happy to be back at Apple, and he announced he was dropping the interim title. The crowd cheered like he was a rock star. Jobs smiled and said he was proud to work with the best people at Apple and Pixar. It was a big moment for him and for Apple. Jobs had a big idea for Apple stores, but the board wasn't excited. Gateway had tried opening stores in cheap places and failed. Jobs said Apple should open stores in more expensive areas, but the board didn't like it. Art Levinson, a board member, said it sounded crazy. Ed Woolard, another member, agreed, saying Dell was doing well without stores. Jobs got frustrated and even threatened to fire people before. Woolard finally left, but before he did, the board let them try 4 stores. Jobs had one strong supporter, Mickey Drexler, who had turned Gap into a huge brand. Drexler understood design and customer needs like Jobs did. He told Jobs to secretly build a store prototype near Apple's campus. Johnson and Jobs rented a warehouse and spent 6 months brainstorming how to make the store perfect. Jobs walked through the space every day, making changes to every detail. One day, Johnson realized they had the store wrong. They were organizing it around products, not what people wanted to do. He told Jobs, and Jobs got angry. But after a long drive in silence, Jobs agreed. He said they would redo the layout, even if it delayed the opening. When the new design was done, the board loved it. The first store opened in Virginia with white counters and a big Think Different poster. The skeptics were wrong. Apple stores became huge successes, with millions in sales. Jobs stayed involved in every detail, even choosing the color of restroom signs. Ron Johnson wasn't happy about the idea of changing the store windows from 18 panes to 4. He thought the 18 looked better and explained why, saying the design worked well with the building's style. But Jobs didn't care. He wanted something simpler, something that showed off Apple's new ideas. Johnson tried to argue, but Jobs wasn't listening. He believed in less is more and that Apple should always be on the cutting edge. Johnson finally gave in, knowing Jobs was right. Meanwhile, Jobs was thinking about the future of technology. He started a yearly retreat with his top people, where they'd brainstorm new ideas. One year, the group talked about what Apple should do next. The tech world was slowing down after the dot-com crash. People thought computers were losing their importance. But Jobs had a plan. He wanted Apple to become a digital hub, a computer that could manage all your digital stuff, like music, videos, and photos. He called it the digital lifestyle. Jobs had a vision for a new kind of computer that could connect with all your devices. He saw this future when he was 30, thinking about music and how people wanted to share it. Now, at 45, he was ready to act. He pushed for new software and hardware that could make this dream real. He even started making apps like iMovie and iTunes to help people create and manage their digital lives. But Jobs wasn't just thinking about software. He wanted to build a new kind of music player that worked perfectly with iTunes. He called it the iPod. It would be simple, powerful, and something people would love. He believed in making things beautiful and easy to use. That's how Apple started changing the world again. At the end of a normal meeting with Toshiba, some engineers told Jobs about a new drive they were making. It was really small, about the size of a silver dollar, and could hold 5 gigabytes of data, enough for 1,000 songs. Rubinstein, who worked with Jobs, knew right away what to do with it. 1,000 songs in your pocket? That was perfect. But he didn't show any excitement. Jobs was in Japan, giving a speech at a big tech event. They met that night at a hotel. Rubinstein told Jobs, "I know how to do it now. All I need is a $10 million check." Jobs agreed right away. Rubinstein started talking to Toshiba about getting exclusive rights to the drives. He also looked for someone to lead the team. Tony Fadell was a smart, confident programmer who had started 3 companies while in college. He had ideas for a better music player, but couldn't get anyone to take them seriously. One day, while skiing, His phone rang. It was Rubinstein, saying Apple wanted someone to work on a small device. Fidel thought he was being offered a job for a personal digital assistant, like the Newton. But when he met with Rubinstein, the conversation was about iTunes and making their own music player. Fidel was excited. He agreed to join, but only as a consultant. After a few weeks, Rubinstein pushed for Fidel to be a full-time employee. Fidel didn't want to lose his freedom. Rubinstein got angry and told him, "This is a life decision. You'll never regret it." Fidel resisted, but eventually he signed on. The two had a lot of tension because they both thought they had created the iPod. They fought over credit for years. Jobs wanted the iPod out by Christmas, so the team had to finish it by October. They partnered with a small company called Portal Player. Fidel told the team this project will change Apple. 10 years from now, it'll be a music business, not a computer one. They made changes to the device, like improving the battery life and making it easier to use. In a big meeting at Apple, Fidel showed Jobs different models of the iPod. Jobs didn't like complicated designs. He preferred things he could touch and feel. Fidel showed a model with a scroll wheel, and Jobs loved it. He told the team to start working on it right away. Jobs was very focused on making the iPod simple. He wanted everything to be easy to use. He tested the user interface, making sure you could find anything in 3 clicks. He also made sure the iPod didn't need an on-off switch. Instead, it would just sleep when not in use and wake up when you touched it. Finally, they had everything: a drive that could hold 1,000 songs, an easy-to-use scroll wheel, and a battery that lasted through all of them. Jobs said, "This is going to be so cool." They knew it would change everything. Jobs wanted the iPod to be more than just a music player. He wanted it to be a symbol of Apple's creativity and simplicity. So, when it came time to design the ads, he had a big idea. They set up a table with different versions of the iPod. On one end, there were simple pictures of the iPod on a white background. On the other end, there were more artistic images, like a silhouette of someone dancing with earphones, showing the music and the emotion behind it. Jobs walked to the simple side first. He liked the clear, straightforward look. He said the artistic ads didn't show what the iPod was. But Vincent suggested adding a tagline, "1,000 songs in your pocket." Jobs agreed. He even took credit for the idea later, saying it was his idea to push for the more iconic ads. The ads helped make the iPod popular. They showed the beauty of the product and the music it held. Jobs loved the ads, even though he sometimes changed his mind. He would stop an ad and say it was too poppy or too trivial. But after some back and forth, he'd usually end up liking it. When the iPod launched, Jobs surprised everyone by pulling it out of his pocket. He showed it off, saying it could hold 1,000 songs. People were skeptical at first, especially about the price. But soon, the iPod became a hit. It was simple, beautiful, and made Apple feel like a creative, innovative company. In March 2002, Jobs called Schuler and asked to bring in Vidich. He also wanted Roger Ames, the head of Warner Music, to join the meeting. This time, Jobs was more relaxed and friendly. Ames was a smart, witty Brit who liked the kind of people Jobs usually worked with. During the meeting, Ames and Eddie Q, who ran iTunes, got into a little argument about music radio in England. Jobs stepped in and said, "We know tech, but we don't know as much about music, so let's not argue." Ames had recently lost a battle to improve AOL's music service, and he was impressed when Jobs showed him a prototype of the iTunes Store. He said, "Yes, that's exactly what we've been waiting for." Ames agreed to help Warner Music join the iTunes Store and even offered to get other companies on board. Jobs then flew to New York to show the service to other Time Warner execs. One person remembered how Jobs sat in front of a Mac like a kid with a toy, totally engaged. Ames and Jobs worked on the details of the iTunes store, including how many times a song could be copied and how to protect the music. They soon got other music companies on board, including Universal Music Group. Doug Morris, the head of Universal, was impressed by how Jobs tied everything together in a simple, safe way for both consumers and music companies. He said, "Steve did something brilliant." Morris even called Jimmy Iovine, his friend at Interscope Geffen A&M, to get his opinion. Iovine said, "This guy is unique." "You're right. He's got a turnkey solution." They decided to stop working with Sony and join Apple instead. Jobs and his team at Apple had a big decision to make. They had to decide if the iPod should work with Windows computers. At first, Jobs didn't want to do it. He thought keeping the iPod for Mac users only would help sell more Macs. But his top team members disagreed. They wanted the iPod to be available to everyone, not just Mac users. Jobs resisted, saying he wouldn't let Windows users use the iPod over my dead body. But they kept pushing. Eventually, Jobs gave in. He said he'd only do it if they could prove it would make sense for the business. They made a spreadsheet showing that even if some Mac sales were lost, iPod sales would grow. Jobs agreed. But he still didn't like the idea of letting Windows users use the iPod. He wanted everything to work together perfectly, like the way the iPod and iTunes worked on Macs. So Apple used a third-party company to make the iPod work on Windows. But the software was slow and clunky. Jobs was frustrated. He wanted to make sure the Windows version of iTunes was just as good as the Mac version. He didn't want to let anyone else control the user experience. That's why Apple finally made iTunes for Windows. When they launched iTunes for Windows, Jobs said it was probably the best Windows app ever. Microsoft wasn't happy. They thought Apple was trying to control everything like they did with the PC. But Apple kept innovating. They made new versions of the iPod, like the Mini and the Shuffle, which made them even more popular. The iTunes Store became a huge success, selling millions of songs and building a loyal customer base. As the iPod became a huge hit, people started asking everyone, "What's on your iPod?" It became a funny and revealing game. When President George W. Bush was asked, people noticed he liked older country music. A writer named Elizabeth Boomiller wrote about it, and it made people think about what music says about who we are. One day, I asked Steve Jobs to show me his iPod. He scrolled through his favorite songs. There were all 6 volumes of his own biography, Bob Dylan's early albums, and a lot of Beatles songs. He didn't include the Stones or Dylan's later work, because he thought they weren't as good as his early stuff. He also had a lot of classic rock and folk music from the 60s and 70s. Only a few songs were from newer artists like U2 or Coldplay. Jobs loved classical music too. He had Bach, especially the Brandenburg concertos, and even played some Gregorian chants. He really liked the contrast between 2 different versions of the Goldberg Variations by Glenn Gould, one young and energetic, the other older and wiser. He said it showed how people change over time. He also liked some of the older songs from his childhood, like Uncle John's Band by the Grateful Dead. He played Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now and talked about how being older made him think differently. He mentioned his son, Reed, who wore a Joan Baez shirt, and said he didn't think about his adoption much anymore. One of the few times Jobs was nervous was when he met Bob Dylan. Dylan was a hero of his, and Jobs was worried Dylan wouldn't be the same. But Dylan was sharp, honest, and sang for him. Jobs later wanted to put all of Dylan's songs on iTunes, but the record company didn't want to do it. Eventually, they made a deal, and Dylan even did an ad for the iPod. Jobs loved working with artists. He believed that music and tech could mix in cool ways. One day, he wanted to use Bob Dylan in an iPod ad. Dylan was a big deal, and some people at Apple didn't think he was still cool. Jobs didn't care. He thought Dylan was perfect for the job. He even got Dylan to re-record the ad to make it look and sound better. The new version had Dylan sitting in a cowboy hat, strumming a guitar, with a woman dancing with an iPod. Jobs loved it. The ad made Dylan's music popular again, and it helped Apple show how much they could do with their brand. Jobs also wanted the Beatles on iTunes. But there was a lot of trouble with Apple Corps, the Beatles company. They had been fighting for years over rights and money. Jobs tried hard to get the Beatles on the platform, but it wasn't easy. He kept pushing, hoping it would happen. He even said it was something he really wanted to fix. Then there was Bono, the singer from U2. Bono wanted to work with Apple because he thought their marketing was great. He asked Jobs to put U2 in an iPod ad for free. Jobs was hesitant at first, but he liked the idea. He even agreed to make a special black iPod for U2. They worked out a deal where U2 would get royalties from the sales. Bono and Jobs became friends, and they even met in a pub to celebrate. The ad worked well, and the album sold a lot. Bono asked Jobs to help with another charity project in 2006. It was called Product Red, and it was meant to raise money and awareness for fighting AIDS in Africa. Jobs wasn't very interested in charity, but he agreed to make a special red iPod for the cause. He didn't like the idea of putting Apple in parentheses next to Red in the product name. He wanted to keep Apple separate. Bono tried to explain that the parentheses showed unity for the cause, but Jobs wasn't having it. They got into a heated argument, but they agreed to think about it. In the end, Jobs let Bono use the special label, but he made sure Apple wasn't in the parentheses. They stayed friends, even though they had some tough talks. Bono and Jobs visited each other's homes, and they even went on boat trips and listened to music together. Despite their friendship, Jobs was still a tough negotiator. They had a hard time agreeing on another ad and a song release, but they kept trying. When Bono got hurt and couldn't tour, Jobs sent him a gift basket with some funny stuff, like a DVD of a comedy show and pain cream. He even wrote a note saying he loved the pain cream. Jobs made some big rules for the new Pixar building. He wanted only 2 bathrooms, one for men and one for women, right in the middle of the atrium. Some people didn't like it, especially a pregnant woman who said she had to walk too far to use the bathroom. That made a big fight. But in the end, they made a compromise. 2 sets of bathrooms on both floors, one on each side of the atrium. Jobs also wanted the steel beams to be visible and looked carefully at samples from different places. He picked a mill in Arkansas and made sure the steel was blasted to a pure color. He even made sure the beams were bolted together, not welded. The workers even brought their families to see the steel being put up. One of the funniest things in the building was called the Love Lounge. An animator found a hidden door in the back of his office that led to a secret room. They decorated it with Christmas lights, lava lamps, and even a bar. They called it the Love Lounge, but Jobs sometimes called it the meditation room. It reminded him of a room he and a friend had at Reed College, but without the acid. Jobs and Michael Eisner had a lot of problems. Eisner criticized Jobs' ads for iTunes, which really upset Jobs. Eisner didn't understand what RIP meant, and it made Jobs very angry. Pixar had made a lot of successful movies, like Finding Nemo, which became the biggest hit in animation history. Jobs used that success to push for a better deal with Disney, but Eisner had a lot of power because he owned the characters. Jobs finally decided to cut off talks with Disney, and he told the world about it. It was a big deal, and people were worried about what would happen to Pixar. But Jobs made them feel confident that Pixar would be okay no matter what. In the end, Disney had to bring in Bob Iger, who was calm and good at handling big egos. He helped fix the situation and made sure Pixar and Disney could still work together. Jobs and Michael Eisner had a lot of problems. Eisner criticized Jobs' ads for iTunes, which really upset Jobs. Eisner didn't understand what RIP meant, and it made Jobs very angry. Pixar had made a lot of successful movies, like Finding Nemo, which became the biggest hit in animation history. Jobs used that success to push for a better deal with Disney, but Eisner had a lot of power because he owned the characters. Jobs finally decided to cut off talks with Disney, and he told the world about it. It was a big deal, and people were worried about what would happen to Pixar. But Jobs made them feel confident that Pixar would be okay no matter what. In the end, Disney had to bring in Bob Iger, who was calm and good at handling big egos. He helped fix the situation and made sure Pixar and Disney could still work together. The impasse was ended on a Saturday night in March 2005 when Iger got a phone call from former Senator George Mitchell and other Disney board members. They told him that, starting in a few months, he would replace Eisner as Disney's CEO. When Iger got up the next morning, he called his daughters and then Steve Jobs and John Lasseter. He said, very simply and clearly, that he valued Pixar and wanted to make a deal. Jobs was thrilled. He liked Iger and even marveled at a small connection they had. His former girlfriend Jennifer Egan and Iger's wife, Willow Bay, had been roommates at Penn. That summer, before Iger officially took over, he and Jobs got to have a trial run at making a deal. Apple was coming out with an iPod that would play video as well as music. It needed TV shows to sell, and Jobs did not want to be too public in negotiating for them because, as usual, he wanted the product to be secret until he unveiled it on stage. Iger, who had multiple iPods and used them throughout the day from his 5 a.m. workouts to late at night, had already been envisioning what it could do for television shows. So he immediately offered ABC's most popular shows, Desperate Housewives and Lost. "We negotiated that deal in a week, and it was complicated," Iger said. "It was important because Steve got to see how I worked, and because it showed everyone that Disney could in fact work with Steve." The G4 Cube looked fancy, but it didn't sell well. Jobs wanted it to be both high-end and mass-market, but neither group wanted it. Professionals didn't want a shiny sculpture on their desk, and regular people didn't want to pay twice as much for a desktop. Jobs thought Apple would sell 200,000 units each quarter, but it only sold half that in the first month. Then it sold even fewer. Jobs realized he had made the Cube too expensive and too fancy. He had made the same mistake with the next computer. The Cube's poor sales hurt Apple's numbers in September 2000, just as the tech bubble was bursting. Apple's stock dropped from over $60 to below $15 in a few months. But Jobs kept pushing for bold, even strange designs. When flat screens became common, he wanted to replace the iMac. Jony Ive came up with a design that looked normal but had a flat screen. Jobs didn't like it. He wanted something purer. He and Ive went to the garden, where Jobs' wife had planted sunflowers. They talked about the design, and Jony suggested making the screen look like a sunflower. They ended up creating a design that looked like a sunflower and a Luxo lamp. Apple got many patents for it, and Jobs even listed himself as the main inventor on one. Jobs kept pushing Apple to innovate, even as other companies focused on cheap, generic designs. He also started planning to switch Apple's chips from PowerPC to Intel, which was a big change. He worked closely with Intel's Paul Otellini, and they finished the switch on time. Jobs also had a complicated relationship with money. He wanted recognition, not just money. But when Apple's stock dropped, his stock options became worthless. He ended up fighting with the board over how much he was being paid, and even tried to backdate options to make them look more valuable. Eventually, the SEC looked into it and didn't charge Jobs, but it was a messy situation for everyone involved. Steve Jobs was known for being tough on rules and not listening to advice he didn't want to hear. People around him sometimes got caught in the middle of his strong opinions, especially when it came to money and how much he was paid. He wanted to seem like he was working for very little, but he also wanted huge rewards in the form of stock. It was a strange mix of ideas, like a rebel who didn't want to give up on the rewards of success. Then, in 2003, Jobs found out he had cancer. He didn't take it seriously at first. He ignored doctors' advice and tried all sorts of weird treatments like diets, acupuncture, and even talking to a psychic. His friends and family were worried, but he didn't want to face the reality of his illness. He kept telling people he was cured and didn't want to talk about it. But in July 2004, a scan showed the cancer had spread. Jobs finally agreed to surgery and chemotherapy. He stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks and struggled to get his strength back. Even then, he didn't give up. He kept pushing himself to walk and stay active, even though his body was still weak. In 2005, he gave a famous speech at Stanford's graduation. He talked about how knowing he was going to die made him focus on what really mattered. He shared 3 stories from his life, and the speech became one of the most inspiring moments of his career. When Steve Jobs returned from his medical leave, Tim Cook took over as the person who kept Apple running smoothly. Cook stayed calm even when Jobs got angry. He said people thought Jobs' comments were just yelling, but it was really just how he showed his passion. Cook said he was a good negotiator, but Jobs was better because he stayed cool under pressure. Jobs said Cook wasn't a product person, but he trusted him to run the company. In the fall of 2005, Jobs made Cook Apple's chief operating officer. He just told him, "I've decided to make you COO." At the same time, some of Jobs' old friends left. Avi Tevanian left because he was tired and made a lot of money. Jobs said he was a genius and a nice guy. John Rubinstein left because he was upset about Cook's rise and had a lot of arguments with Jony Ive. Jobs chose Ive over Rubinstein, and Rubinstein left to work for Palm. Jobs built a new team with Cook, Ive, and others. They all had different styles, but they all knew they had to be respectful to Jobs while also arguing with him. Jobs used Monday morning meetings to make sure everyone was focused on the future and working together. He also started Apple University to teach new employees how Apple made decisions. Even after his illness, Jobs stayed passionate and made bold moves. He was still a bit rough, but he was less mean than before. He had a hard time being kind to strangers, but he was still a powerful leader. His team learned to cope with his way of working. In 2005, iPod sales were going crazy. 20 million were sold that year, 4 times more than the year before. The iPod was becoming a huge part of Apple's money, and it was also making Apple look cool, which helped sell more Macs. But Jobs was worried. He always thought about what could hurt Apple. He believed the next big threat was the cell phone. He saw how cameras in phones were hurting digital cameras, and thought the same could happen to the iPod if phones started including music players. Jobs wanted to make a phone that could work with the iPod. He tried to partner with Motorola, but the result, the Roque R, was a mess. It was hard to use and didn't look good. Jobs got frustrated and decided to make the phone himself. He started thinking about making a phone that was simple and fun to use without all the complicated stuff. At the same time, there was a secret project at Apple to make a tablet. The ideas from that project helped shape the phone. Jobs wanted a touchscreen that could handle multiple fingers at once, which led to the idea of multi-touch. He tested it and loved it. He realized it could solve the phone's interface problem. Jobs and his team worked hard on the phone, trying different ways to make it work. They decided to go with the multi-touch idea, even though it was risky. They also made a glass screen for the phone, working with Corning to make it strong and scratch-resistant. They called it Gorilla Glass. So Jobs kept pushing for more Gorilla Glass. He wanted as much as Corning could make in 6 months. Weeks told him they didn't have the capacity. Jobs didn't care. He said, "You can do it." Weeks was stunned. He tried to explain it wasn't that simple, but Jobs didn't listen. He stared at Weeks and said, "Yes, you can do it." Weeks was amazed. In the end, they did it in under 6 months. They made a new kind of glass that had never been made before. Corning's factory in Kentucky switched from making LCDs to making Gorilla Glass full-time. They used their best scientists and engineers. It worked. Jobs also changed the design of the iPhone. He didn't like the first look. He told Joni Ive, "I didn't sleep last night because I realized I just don't love it." Ive was surprised. He knew Jobs was right. Jobs wanted the screen to be the main focus. He didn't want the case to compete with it. The new design had a thin stainless steel bezel so the screen could go all the way to the edge. It looked simple but still friendly. It meant they had to redo the inside of the phone too. Jobs ordered it anyway. He wanted it perfect. The iPhone was ready to launch. Jobs gave a big presentation at Macworld in San Francisco. He introduced it as one device, not 3 separate things. He called it the iPhone. When it came out, people were excited. Jobs and his wife went to the Apple store in Palo Alto. Fans waited for them. It was like a big event. The iPhone was called the Jesus phone by some. But it was expensive, and some said it wouldn't sell. But it did. By 2010, Apple had sold 90 million iPhones. It made a lot of money. So, here's what happened next. Steve Jobs was getting really sick. He had cancer that had spread to his liver, and it was making him feel terrible. He didn't want to talk about it, and he didn't want people to know how bad it was. He even lied about his health to the public, saying he had a hormone problem that could be fixed with medicine. But the truth was, his body was failing, and he was in a lot of pain. Jobs tried all kinds of treatments, including some very new and experimental ones. He even flew to Switzerland and Rotterdam for special therapies. But nothing was working the way he wanted. His doctors were worried, and his wife, Laureen, and his kids were scared. They had to make quick decisions, like moving him to a hospital in Memphis where he could get a liver transplant. It was a race against time. Jobs got a transplant, but the cancer had already spread. He almost died from a bad reaction to a medical procedure, and his family was there for him, holding on to hope. His doctors and nurses worked hard to keep him alive, and even his friends and family helped take care of his kids while he was in the hospital. Jobs was still strong in spirit, even when he was weak in body. He fought to stay in control, even when he couldn't. He was scared, but he didn't give up. He was determined to keep fighting, even as his health got worse. After his health scare, Jobs was still very sick, but he didn't want to let anyone know how bad it was. He even wore a mask over his face when he was deeply sedated. Jobs ripped it off and said he hated the design and refused to wear it. He ordered them to bring 5 different options for the mask and pick one he liked. The doctors were confused, but finally, Powell distracted him so they could put the mask on. He also didn't like the oxygen monitor on his finger, saying it was ugly and too complicated. He suggested ways it could be simpler. One day, Powell's friend Catherine Smith came to visit. She had a rocky relationship with Jobs, but Powell insisted she come. Jobs motioned her over, got a pad and pen, and wrote, "I want my iPhone." Smith brought it, and he showed her how to use it. Jobs had a strained relationship with his daughter Lisa, but she flew to Memphis twice, and he appreciated it. He didn't tell her at the time. As Jobs got better, his strong personality came back. He was still picky about food, only eating fruit smoothies and demanding many options. Eason told him to think of it as medicine, not food. When Apple employees came to visit, Jobs got excited. He loved talking about new products and even got into details like the font and size of the iPhone model name. He even visited a music studio and told Riley to hire a young employee for iTunes. After returning to Palo Alto, Jobs was still struggling with his role at Apple. He was worried he wasn't as important as he used to be. But he pushed through the pain and started working again. He even threw a few temper tantrums on his first day back, but was excited to be back. He gave a heartfelt speech at Apple's event, thanking everyone and announcing new products. He had recovered enough to be productive again. Jobs was trying to make his own chips for the iPhone, but Intel wasn't listening. He and his team kept telling Intel their graphics were bad, but Intel didn't care. Jobs got frustrated because he wanted full control over everything, from the chip to the design. He didn't want to teach Intel everything because they might sell it to competitors. There was also a big fight over who would control the design and how much it would cost. Jobs was used to making everything himself, and he couldn't stand not being in charge. When the iPad came out in January 2010, it was a huge deal. Jobs made a big show of it, showing how it could do things like email, web browsing, and watching videos. He even used it to send an email and play a song. The iPad was supposed to be the future of computing, but some people didn't get it. They called it a maxi-pad and made fun of the name. Even Bill Gates said he still thought netbooks would win. Jobs was worried about the criticism and felt let down. But when the iPad started selling, people loved it. It became one of the biggest product launches in history. Jobs kept working hard to make sure the iPad was perfect, and he even changed the way he did ads. He wanted something big and new, but he wasn't clear about what he wanted. His team had to work hard to come up with something he would like. Jobs was picky, but he also knew how to make people excited about his products. After the iPad came out, people were talking a lot about it. Steve Jobs wanted the ads to make a big statement, not just show off the product. He wanted something that would remind everyone that the iPad was the real deal, not just a copycat. So his team started working on what they called the manifesto. It was fast, had cool music, and made big claims about how amazing the iPad was. It said things like, "iPad is thin. iPad is beautiful. It's crazy powerful. It's magical." The ads were loud and full of energy, just like Jobs. But then he wanted something softer, like a real-life story. He liked it for a while, but then he got bored. He didn't like it because it felt too normal, like a regular ad. He wanted Apple's voice, simple, clean, and honest. So they went back to basics, white background, close-up shots, and just showing what the iPad could do. The ads weren't about the iPad itself, but about what you could do with it. Like playing games, reading books, watching videos, and more. Apps were a big part of the iPad's success. At first, Steve didn't want people to make apps for the iPhone, but later he saw the value. He let developers create apps, but only if they met strict rules and were approved by Apple. This made the App Store a safe and controlled place for apps. Soon, there were thousands of apps for the iPad, and it changed the way people used digital devices. Steve also tried to help the newspaper business, especially the New York Times. He wanted to find a way to make digital news pay, but the publishers were worried about losing control of their customers. He offered a deal, but they didn't take it at first. Eventually, the Times started charging for its digital edition, but not at the price Steve suggested. Steve was trying to make sure Apple stayed in control of its products and how they worked. He didn't like it when other companies copied Apple's ideas, especially when they used them without permission. One big fight was with Google, which made Android a competing phone system. Steve was angry because Google used features from the iPhone, like multi-touch and swipe gestures, without asking. He thought it was unfair and even said Google's "Don't Be Evil" slogan was just fake. Steve and Google's leaders, like Eric Schmidt, had a meeting where they talked about this. Steve was very upset, saying Google had stolen Apple's designs. He wanted Google to stop using Apple's ideas and didn't care about money. Even though they talked, nothing was resolved. Steve believed in keeping Apple's system closed and controlled, just like it had been in the past. He saw this as a big fight between Apple's way of doing things and Google's open, shared approach. Steve was determined to protect Apple's ideas, even if it meant going to war with Google. He believed Apple's closed system was better for users and for innovation, even if it meant fewer choices. Steve didn't like when other companies used Apple's ideas without permission. He believed that Apple's closed system, where he had full control over everything, was the best way to make great products. But Google, with its open platform called Android, was fighting back. Steve thought Google was stealing Apple's designs and using them without asking. He even said Google's "Don't Be Evil" slogan wasn't real. Bill Gates, who had once fought against Microsoft, watched Steve battle Google. Gates thought there were benefits to being open, like more choices and competition. He said Apple's closed system was good for control, but it also limited what other companies could do. Steve didn't care about money. He just wanted to make the best products, not bad ones like Android. Steve also fought with Adobe over Flash, a program used for websites. He called Flash buggy and said it made phones slower and less secure. He banned apps that used Flash on Apple devices. He wanted developers to make apps that only worked on Apple's system, not on other platforms. He believed that made Apple's products better. Sometimes Apple's control caused problems. They banned apps that were political or pornographic, even if they were harmless. When they blocked an app with political cartoons, it made people laugh and criticize Apple for being too strict. Steve apologized, but he still believed in keeping things under control. Steve was getting ready for the iPhone 4 launch, but things didn't go as planned. A few dropped calls became a huge problem. People started calling it Antennagate. Consumer Reports said they wouldn't recommend the phone because of the antenna issue. Steve was in Hawaii with his family when this happened. He was angry and defensive. He blamed Google and Motorola for making trouble. Art Levinson, his friend and Apple's CEO, tried to calm him down. He told Steve to be humble and look at the problem. Steve didn't like that. He felt Apple was always right and didn't need to act like it was wrong. He got really upset and even said, "Fuck this, it's not worth it." But then Tim Cook, his trusted friend, talked to him. Cook reminded Steve that Apple was becoming like Microsoft, and that made Steve rethink. He decided to face the problem head-on. Steve flew back from Hawaii and called some old friends, Regis McKenna and Lee Clow, who had helped him before. He also brought his son Reed to the meeting. They all worked together to figure out how to handle the situation. Steve wanted to be firm but not arrogant. He decided to tell the truth and show that Apple was trying to fix things. At the press event, he didn't apologize, but he made it clear that phones aren't perfect and that Apple was doing its best. He also said other phones had similar problems, which helped shift the conversation. People started to believe him, and sales went up again. After the launch event, Jobs was energized. He came to the Four Seasons Hotel to join me, his wife, and Reed, plus Reed's 2 Stanford pals, for lunch. For a change, he was eating, though still with some pickiness. He ordered fresh squeezed juice, which he sent back 3 times, declaring that each new offering was from a bottle, and a pasta primavera, which he shoved away as inedible after one taste. But then he ate half of my crab Louis salad and ordered a full one for himself, followed by a bowl of ice cream. The indulgent hotel was even able to produce a glass of juice that finally met his standards. At his house the following day, he was still on a high. He was planning to fly to Kona Village the next day, alone, and I asked to see what he had put on his iPad 2 for the trip. There were 3 movies: Chinatown, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, The Bourne Ultimatum, and Toy Story 3. More revealingly, there was just one book that he had downloaded: the autobiography of a yogi, the guide to meditation and spirituality that he had first read as a teenager, then reread in India, and had read once a year ever since. Midway through the morning, he decided he wanted to eat something. He was still too weak to drive, so I drove him to a cafe and a shopping mall. It was closed, but the owner was used to Jobs knocking on the door at off hours, and he happily let us in. "He's taken on a mission to try to fatten me up," Jobs joked. His doctors had pushed him to eat eggs as a source of high-quality protein, and he ordered an omelet. Living with a disease like this, and all the pain, constantly reminds you of your own mortality, and that can do strange things to your brain if you're not careful, he said. You don't make plans more than a year out, and that's bad. You need to force yourself to plan as if you will live for many years. An example of this magical thinking was his plan to build a luxurious yacht. Before his liver transplant, he and his family used to rent a boat for vacations, traveling to Mexico, the South Pacific, or the Mediterranean. On many of these cruises, Jobs got bored or began to hate the design of the boat, so they would cut the trip short and fly to Kona Village. But sometimes the cruise worked well. The best vacation I've ever been on was when we went down the coast of Italy, then to Athens, which is a pit, but the Parthenon is mind-blowing, and then to Ephesus in Turkey, where they have these ancient public lavatories in marble with a place in the middle for musicians to serenade. When they got to Istanbul, he hired a history professor to give his family a tour. At the end, they went to a Turkish bath, where the professor's lecture gave Jobs an insight about the globalization of youth. I had a real revelation. We were all in robes, and they made some Turkish coffee for us. The professor explained how the coffee was made very different from anywhere else, and I realized, so fucking what? Which kids even in Turkey give a shit about Turkish coffee? All day I had looked at young people in Istanbul. They were all drinking what every other kid in the world drinks, and they were wearing clothes that looked like they were bought at the Gap, and they are all using cell phones. They were like kids everywhere else. It hit me that, for young people, this whole world is the same now. When we're making... Steve Jobs was showing off his new idea, iCloud. He was proud of how it worked. Everything synced instantly. Music, photos, even documents. It was simple, but that's what made Apple special. Other companies had cloud ideas too, like Microsoft and Google, but they didn't control everything. Apple had the whole chain: devices, software, content. That's why iCloud worked so well. Jobs didn't want to make Android users happy. He wanted Apple users to stay loyal. Once you started using iCloud, it was hard to switch to another system. Your music wouldn't work on new devices. That's how Apple kept its customers. Jobs also wanted a new office for Apple. He bought land near his old job at HP. He wanted a building that showed Apple's values. He worked with top architects, but he changed the design a lot. At first, it looked like a racetrack. Then it became a circle. He loved glass and curved shapes. He wanted the building to feel open and natural. He planted trees and apricot orchards to honor the land's history. One day, he showed the plans to the city council. He looked relaxed, wearing his usual black sweater. He called the building a spaceship. Later, he asked an old friend, Ann Bowers, to see the plans. He was tired and in pain, but he wanted to share his vision. He asked her about his past. She said he was impetuous, but had a strong vision. Jobs agreed. He had learned a lot. During Reed's graduation, Jobs got a message from his father saying how proud he was. That night, there was a big family party. Reed danced with everyone, including his dad. Later, Jobs took Reed to a shed and gave him a bike. Reed joked about the Italian one, so Jobs gave him the other one. Reed said he'd be in debt, but Jobs said he didn't need to be, because he had his DNA. A few days later, Toy Story 3 came out. Jobs had helped start the Pixar movies, and this one was about Andy leaving for college. Andy's mom said she wished he could always be with her. He told her he always would be. Jobs had a closer relationship with his son, but not with his daughters. His younger daughter, Erin, was quiet and thoughtful. She wanted to be an architect, maybe because of her dad's interest. But when Jobs showed her the Apple campus plans, he didn't include her. She wanted to go to the Oscars with her dad, but he canceled the trip because of his health. Her mom took her to France instead. Later, Jobs went to Hawaii with his family, but he had a toothache and had to get it fixed. He also had to go back to work after the iPhone 4 problem. Eventually, he took them to Japan, where they stayed in a quiet inn. Erin said it was fantastic. Jobs had a strong relationship with his wife, Lorene. She was smart and caring, and she helped him with his work and family. She started a program to help kids go to college, and Jobs admired her work. Jobs kept pushing for more American engineers. He said Apple had 700,000 workers in China, but they needed 30,000 engineers there to help. He thought the U.S. could train those engineers at trade schools or community colleges. He told the president this would help bring manufacturing back to America. The president liked the idea and talked about it a lot. Jobs was happy because Obama was listening. He even offered to help make political ads for Obama's 2012 campaign. He had done that before, but he got upset when the campaign team wasn't very respectful. Jobs was fighting cancer again. He had pain, lost his appetite, and stopped eating. His doctors didn't find tumors at first, but they thought it was just another problem. His body was getting weaker, and he was losing a lot of weight. His wife, Lorene, and his family tried to help him eat, but he kept refusing. He even started thinking about fasting again, like he used to when he was young. His body was broken, and he was in a lot of pain. His doctors finally realized he needed better care. They brought in specialists to help with his treatment. They did gene testing on his cancer and found ways to treat it with drugs that targeted the cancer cells. Jobs was still in charge of his own decisions, even though he was very sick. He met with doctors and scientists to plan his next steps. He stayed strong even as his body weakened. Lisa, his daughter, came to visit after a long time. She was hurt by how he had treated her before, but they made up. He asked her to move back to Palo Alto if she wanted to be close to him. She didn't, but he was glad she came. He also met with Larry Page, the Google co-founder, and they talked about running companies and staying focused. Steve Jobs was still sick, but he was trying to stay strong. He was thinking about the future of Apple and what he wanted to leave behind. He told people he wanted to focus on just 5 products, not more. He said the other ones were holding Apple back and making it like Microsoft, which made products that were okay but not amazing. He wanted to help the next generation of leaders remember how Apple became great. People started coming to visit him at his house in Palo Alto. Bill Clinton came and talked about politics and the Middle East. But the most special visit was from Bill Gates, his old rival and friend. Gates came to talk about how Apple had done amazing things with the iPad, and how Jobs was still making it better even while he was sick. They talked for a long time, like old friends. They even talked about education and how computers could change schools. Jobs was still weak, but he was smiling and full of energy. He and Gates talked about their different ways of making computers and agreed that both had worked in their own way. Jobs said Gates's way had made some bad products, but Gates said Jobs's way had made great ones. They both agreed they were right, but only when they were in charge. Jobs also had ideas for new products, like an easy-to-use TV and better textbooks for students. But his cancer was getting worse, and he was in a lot of pain. He was spending more time in bed and not going to work. In the end, he had to make a big decision. He was going to resign as CEO of Apple. He wanted to make sure the transition was smooth and that Apple would keep growing. He told his board in a quiet meeting that he was leaving and that Tim Cook would take over. The room was silent, and everyone felt the weight of the moment. After the meeting with his board, Jobs rode home with George Riley. When they got to the house, Powell was in the backyard getting honey from her bees, with help from Eve. They took off their helmets and brought the honey pot to the kitchen, where Reed and Aaron were waiting. They all celebrated the smooth change in leadership. Jobs took a spoonful of honey and said it was delicious. That night, he told me he hoped to stay busy with new projects and ideas. He wanted to keep working on products and marketing. But when I asked how it felt to give up control of the company he built, his voice got quiet. He started talking about his past, saying he had a lucky life and had done all he could. He was tired, but he was still full of energy. He smiled a lot, even though his body was weak. He was proud of what he had done, but he was also sad to be leaving. He wanted to make sure Apple stayed strong and kept growing. He was ready to step back and let someone else take the lead. He had done his part. Steve Jobs became one of the most important business leaders in history. People will remember him for making products that changed the world. He mixed art and technology in a way that few others could. His way of working was intense, and it made Apple one of the most creative companies ever. He believed in making products that people didn't even know they wanted. He didn't just follow what customers asked for, he imagined what they would want in the future. He said that great artists and engineers are similar because they both want to express themselves. He thought Apple's success was because of the deep human feelings in its designs. He also talked about how companies like Microsoft focused too much on money and not enough on creating great products. He admired people like Walt Disney and Hewlett and Packard because they built companies that lasted for generations. He wanted Apple to be like that too. He believed in being honest and pushing people to do better. He had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to say what he thought, even if it was hard. He also talked about death and the idea that something might live on after we're gone. He wasn't sure if he believed in an afterlife, but he wanted to believe that part of him would stay in the work he left behind. After Steve Jobs left Apple in 1985, he started a new company called Next. He wanted to make computers that were smarter and more powerful than anything before. He hired top engineers and designers, and he worked hard to create something special. But running a company on his own was tough. He had big ideas, but sometimes he didn't listen to others. He pushed his team to work faster and harder, and sometimes that made people frustrated. Even though he was excited about his new project, he missed the support and teamwork he had at Apple. He also had to deal with money problems and competition from other companies. Still, he believed in what he was doing and kept trying to make his vision come true. He wanted to prove that he could build something great again, even without Apple. After Steve Jobs left Apple in 1985, he started a new company called Next. He wanted to make computers that were smarter and more powerful than anything before. He hired top engineers and designers, and he worked hard to create something special. But running a company on his own was tough. He had big ideas, but sometimes he didn't listen to others. He pushed his team to work faster and harder, and sometimes that made people frustrated. Even though he was excited about his new project, he missed the support and teamwork he had at Apple. He also had to deal with money problems and competition from other companies. Still, he believed in what he was doing and kept trying to make his vision come true. He wanted to prove that he could build something great again, even without Apple. In 1988, Steve Jobs finally launched Next. It was a powerful computer that ran on a new operating system called Next Step. He worked closely with a group of talented people, including some from Apple. But things were still hard. His company didn't sell as well as he hoped, and he had to deal with legal problems from Apple, which wanted to take back some of his work. Even so, he kept pushing forward, believing that he could change the world again. In 1988, Steve Jobs finally launched Next. It was a powerful computer that ran on a new operating system called Next Step. He worked closely with a group of talented people, including some from Apple. But things were still hard. His company didn't sell as well as he hoped, and he had to deal with legal problems from Apple, which wanted to take back some of his work. Even so, he kept pushing forward, believing that he could change the world again. Even though Next wasn't a huge success right away, Steve kept working on his vision. He didn't give up, even when things got tough. He knew he had something special, and he was determined to make it happen. He spent time with his team, giving them ideas and pushing them to be their best. He believed in the power of design and simplicity, and he wanted to create something that people would love. In the years that followed, Steve kept building, learning, and growing. He found new ways to think about technology and how it could make people's lives better. He stayed focused on his goals, even when others doubted him. He knew that the future was full of possibilities, and he was ready to shape it. His passion and drive never faded, and he kept moving forward, even when the path was hard. The narrative presented is a detailed and comprehensive list of names, entities, and technical terms, likely extracted from a book or document about the history of technology, particularly focusing on Apple and its key figures. It does not contain a coherent story or narrative with emotional elements. Therefore, it is not possible to assign a mood or emotional tone to this part. The narrative presents a rich tapestry of technological innovation, personal struggles, and cultural impact, reflecting a complex interplay of ambition, creativity, and perseverance. It captures the essence of a journey marked by both triumphs and setbacks, with a tone that is reflective and driven. After Steve Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003, his health began to decline rapidly. The disease, which is often called a silent killer, progressed quickly, and Jobs faced difficult treatment decisions. He initially chose not to undergo surgery or chemotherapy, believing that the side effects would outweigh the benefits. However, as his condition worsened, he eventually agreed to a more aggressive treatment plan, including surgery and chemotherapy. Despite these efforts, his cancer continued to spread, and he faced the reality of his limited time. During this period, Jobs focused on his work with Apple, pushing for new product launches and innovations, even as his health deteriorated. He also spent time with his family, reflecting on his life and legacy. The experience deeply affected him, and he became more introspective, often speaking about the importance of living fully and leaving a meaningful impact. In the final months of his life, Jobs continued to work on Apple projects, including the development of the iPhone and the iPad, even as he prepared for the end of his life. His illness brought both personal challenges and a renewed sense of purpose, as he sought to make the most of the time he had left. In 2000, the design company Frog Design changed its name to Frog Design. The new name was chosen by the founder, David Esslinger. He picked it because frogs can change their shape, which symbolizes growth and transformation. But he also wanted to honor the company's roots in Germany. The name's lowercase letters were a tribute to the Bauhaus movement, which believed in a simple, democratic way of communicating. This showed the company's belief in teamwork and shared ideas. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs was still working hard at Apple, even as his health got worse. He was focused on new projects, like the iPhone and iPad, which he thought would change the world. Even though he was sick, he stayed determined and creative. He wanted to leave a lasting mark on technology and design. His work at Apple continued, even as he faced the reality of his illness. He used his time to push for innovation and to make sure his ideas would live on. He wanted to make the most of what little time he had left. So, what are the key lessons from this book? First, the importance of staying true to your vision. Steve Jobs was driven by a clear idea of what he wanted to create, even when it meant going against the crowd. He knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to fight for it. Another key lesson is the power of simplicity. Jobs believed that great design comes from stripping away the unnecessary. He taught us that less is more, and that clarity can be incredibly powerful. Then there's the value of passion and purpose. Jobs lived with intensity, and he believed that you must love what you do. He didn't just work hard, he worked with fire, and that energy was contagious. Also, don't be afraid to fail. Jobs faced setbacks, lost people, and made mistakes, but he never gave up. He learned from each failure and used it to fuel his next great idea. Finally, the importance of relationships. Jobs had a way of inspiring and pushing people to be their best. He surrounded himself with brilliant minds and gave them the space to shine. That's how he built Apple into the company it became.